I have Mrs. Karin Lexén, the Secretary General of SSNC, who will do a short remark before we go into the sessions. And today we are broadcasting through our YouTube channel, which I hope you are all watching right now. And you will, as yesterday, be able to post questions in the YouTube channel, but you need to be logged in to be able to post questions. And for those of you who didn't join us yesterday, this is an initiative of the newly started network, which is called Grönt Bistånd, or Green Aid, which is kind of loose coalition of Swedish development organizations who want to see more focus on environment within the development sector. And hopefully this network will form into a formal working group at Concord during next year, and we'll see how that will develop. Yesterday we looked at what biodiversity is. We discussed the current state of biodiversity, which is quite depressing, to be frank. We had some discussions on the drivers behind the loss of biodiversity and connected it to the land and the ocean use by people and our societies. We also looked at how biodiversity is linked to development and basically concluded that biodiversity is development in the sense that people living in poverty are dependent on their surroundings and the functioning ecosystems. And we also looked at different examples on how civil society, the Swedish civil society and our partners are working on development projects that support that, biodiversity. We looked at agroforestry, we looked at SSNC's work with small-scale fishing communities, etc. And we concluded that there is a strong linkages between human rights, gender, and environment. The purpose of today and the session we will have forward is to look at biodiversity from the perspective of international frameworks and international negotiations that are taking place on biodiversity this year and the coming year. We will also look at the role of companies, and we will conclude the half-day with a discussion on the future of international aid in the light of the biodiversity loss that we are experiencing. We have a number of very interesting guests with us today. Amongst others, we have the UN Special Rapporteur on Environment and Human Rights, Mr. David Boyd, and we also have the Assistant Secretary General of the UNDP, Ulrika Moder. And each of the panelists will be presenting during the different sessions. But before going into our first session, we have Karin, who will make a short reflection on the issues that we will be discussing today. And I will kind of start then to ask you, Karin, why do we even need international negotiations? Isn't it enough with national legislations on environment and biodiversity? So maybe you can reflect upon that subject a bit. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Victor, and it's a very good question. I'll try to respond to that one later on in what I'm reflecting. But first of all, I find this webinar very interesting. I think it's really interesting and inspiring to see the growing interest in environmental issues by people working on development issues, and to see that the understanding of the importance of biodiversity for building resilience is increasing. And to say at least, we are really at a crossroad, and we face a key momentum when it comes to biodiversity. Many of you are certainly familiar with the Paris Agreement and the international negotiations on climate. What is less known is that there is a similar process going on relating to biodiversity. Before 2020 turned into the year of pandemic, it was called the super year for nature and biodiversity. And the reason for this is that parties, meaning governments worldwide, to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity were supposed to meet in China this October to agree on a new framework and new targets on biodiversity. Also, the 2020 United Nations Ocean Conference was scheduled to take place in Lisbon, Portugal in June. And we also have the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, which is being negotiated right now, and the Commission has presented a proposal. And these different processes have, of course, been affected and delayed by the pandemic, but they are still ongoing, and they are still equally important, to say the least. The ongoing pandemic might even function as a lever, since, as we see, there are many linkages between the pandemic and biodiversity, and one might hope that this makes people think about our dependence on healthy ecosystems and the biodiversity. So we need to act now, and we need to raise our ambitions. And to respond on the question, why international agreements and why these very bureaucratic, slow processes to try to come together on decisions globally? Well, I've worked on environmental issues for many years, and I have seen that these agreements are important since we are mutually dependent on each other. Environmental pollutants doesn't know any borders, and we need to act together on this. And so at present, there are many different entry points when it comes to regulations, agreements, decisions. We have the Convention on Biodiversity. We have regulations on agriculture. We all know that the agriculture issues are drivers, how we use land, etc., is very important for the loss of biodiversity, or also solutions on not having such a big loss on biodiversity. And we have several treaties on the use of chemicals. Another angle is the attempts to regulate how the extractive industry is conducting its operations in terms of guidelines for so-called due diligence. And we also have the SDGs, where the goal 12, 14, and 15 specifically relates to biodiversity. Of course, it's difficult to say, and it's not evident which of these will prove to be efficient and how it will work out. But what is really evident from our point of view is that we need regulations that are mandatory. We need very ambitious agreements, and they need to be implemented. And I couldn't stress more the latter part, that they need to be implemented and really regarded as very crucial for our survival. To add to this, key for raising the world's ambition on biodiversity, especially now, is that civil society is active in its advocacy work, and that civil society is participating also in the different international processes on international agreements. This has certainly been the case when it comes to climate negotiation, but it needs to be scaled up when it comes to biodiversity. And here, of course, one major concern is the trend of shrinking civil space that we have witnessed over the last decade. And this is also true when it comes to international negotiations. For example, the climate conferences, where we see that civil society faces difficulties in getting their voices heard, in being able to participate, in being able to really know what is happening. So there's a lot of things that needs to be done in order to increase the role of civil society and to get their voices heard. So this trend of shrinking space needs to be reversed, and we all need to join hands in order to push back to make it possible. Last but not least, as the coming first session of today will highlight, there is a strong need to connect the human rights nexus with environment. For too long, these two sectors have been separated. But a healthy environment must build upon respect for human rights, and the strive for human rights cannot ignore the ongoing climate and biodiversity crisis. The human rights and environmental communities must seek responses to the climate as well as biodiversity crisis together. We need to join hands, we need to form unexpected coalitions, and we need to demand a just and healthy environment. And by that, I will leave over for the first session with the name The Right to a Healthy and Sustainable Environment. The time is now. And I will leave over to my colleague, Maria Rydlund, who is Senior Advisor at the SSNC, Naturskyddsföreningen. Thank you all, and see you later.
So, thank you so much, Karin. My name is Maria Rydlund. I'm working as a senior policy advisor on tropical forest at SSNC. Working with tropical forests really highlights the connection between environment and human rights. And I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. David Boyd. He's an environmental lawyer, and right now he's currently serving as the UN Special Rapporteur on human rights and the environment. He will link up virtually because he's based in West Coast in Canada, so we have completely different time zones. So he will send his message through this video, which is taped in his cottage in Canada. So please enjoy his talk.
Hello, I'm Dr. David Boyd, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and I'm delighted to be joining you today virtually from my cabin on Pender Island all the way to Sweden. You know, it's absolutely clear that despite the COVID-19 pandemic, we remain embroiled in a global environmental crisis. There are interlocking issues, of course, the climate emergency, where we're seeing the highest levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in more than 3 million years. 2019, highest average global temperatures on record, lowest levels of Arctic sea ice on record, highest ocean temperatures on record. But we live not only in a climate emergency, but also in a nature emergency. According to the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, there are over 1 million species at risk. So biodiversity is really in free fall across the world. Also, we have the Living Planet report from WWF and the London Zoological Society showing a 60% decline in wildlife populations just since 1970. And we also have a global public health crisis. Air pollution kills far more people than the COVID-19 virus has killed, with the latest estimate from the World Health Organization being about 7 million premature deaths every year caused by air pollution, including hundreds of thousands of children under the age of 5. So these interlocking crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, are symptoms of our dysfunctional relationship as human beings with the rest of the world, the rest of the natural world. And as a result of this dysfunctional relationship, the world's leading scientists are calling for systemic and transformative changes. Both IPBES, whom I mentioned earlier, as well as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, are calling for these transformative types of changes. And interestingly, that's exactly what young people around the world are calling for as well, led by Sweden's Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for the Future strikers. Young people and scientists are really on the same page. And so it's interesting to look at that from a human rights perspective, because over the course of human history, human rights have been a catalyst for transformative changes on countless occasions, dating back to the abolitionists who relied on the right to freedom to overcome slavery, the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, the movement of indigenous peoples, LGBTQ plus peoples. All of these movements have harnessed the transformative power of human rights as stories to change societies in transformative and lasting ways. Now, human rights are not magic wand that can instantly or easily transform human societies, but they do have the capacity to catalyze transformative change. And that's why personally I'm really excited about the emergence of what I believe to be one of the most important human rights of the 21st century, the right to live in a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And this isn't a new human right. In fact, many indigenous cultures around the world have recognized human rights and responsibilities vis-a-vis the natural world for thousands of years. I've worked with indigenous communities here in Canada for whom the right to live in a healthy environment, and more importantly to them, the responsibility to protect nature, are core elements of their customary legal systems. In terms of the Western world, however, it was the Stockholm Declaration in 1972 that was really the first recognition of the right to live in a healthy environment. It was a political declaration, not legally binding, but it served as the impetus for what has happened over the course of the past 48 years, which has been one of the most rapid emergences of a new human right in all of history. So from the Stockholm Declaration in 1972, Portugal was the first country to include the right to a healthy environment in its constitution in 1976, followed by Spain in 1978, and now there are at least 110 countries across the world where the right to a healthy environment is included in the country's constitution, its highest and strongest law, and constitutions are not just legal documents, they're reflections of a country's real soul, its deepest and most cherished aspirations. In addition to those countries, there are 101 countries where the right to a healthy environment is explicitly included in environmental laws, and close to 130 countries that have signed regional human rights treaties that include the right to a healthy environment. With the pioneering African Charter on Human and People's Rights in 1981, the San Salvador Protocol in 1988, the Aarhus Convention covering Europe, Asia, and other countries in 1998, the Arab Charter, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Declaration on Human Rights in 2012. Anyways, when you add up constitutions, legislation, and countries that have ratified these treaties, you get 80% of UN member nations. That's 156 out of 193 countries that already recognize people have this fundamental human right to live in a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And that's really exciting. Of course, one of my jobs as the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment is to try and get this right to apply in all countries, everywhere. I mean, human rights are intended to be universally recognized. And so I'm working with a group of states, both in Geneva at the Human Rights Council and in New York at the UN General Assembly, to try and push for pioneering UN resolutions that would recognize everyone, everywhere, has the right to live in a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. But what we've learned over more than 4 decades of experience at the national and regional levels with this fundamental human right is that it has both procedural aspects and substantive aspects. And my predecessor as the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, Professor John Knox, did a really terrific job of articulating the procedural elements of the right to a healthy environment, which are access to information, public participation in decision-making, and access to justice with effective remedies. These are rights that are well known in international human rights law and that John clarified and then expressed in his framework Principles on Human Rights and the Environment, published in 2018. My focus as Special Rapporteur has been on the substantive side of the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And I've identified 6 key substantive elements. And I'm doing a series of reports to the United Nations about each of these elements. So in 2019, my first report to the Human Rights Council was about clean air as a fundamental aspect of the right to a healthy environment. My second report, which was to the General Assembly last year, was about a safe climate, also as a fundamental part of the right to a healthy environment. I'm currently working on a report about the need for a healthy biosphere, again, as one of the foundational elements of the right to a healthy environment. And then the other 3 reports in that series of reports will deal with access to clean water and adequate sanitation, healthy and sustainably produced food, and non-toxic environments in which people can live, work, study, and play. And what we know about these rights is when they're recognized, they do make a difference. They make a difference in terms of environmental outcomes. They make a difference, more importantly, in terms of protecting people's fundamental human rights. And so there's been a series of studies that have been done over the course of the past decade, including some research that I did at the University of British Columbia. And we know this, that when the right to a healthy environment is recognized in a country, it has a knock-on or a catalyst effect in terms of promoting stronger environmental legislation, improved implementation and enforcement of those stronger laws, higher levels of public participation and access to information about environmental issues, reduced environmental injustices, and most importantly, there's a causal relationship. Economists have published articles proving that there is a causal relationship between recognition of the right to a healthy environment and improved environmental performance. More rapid decreases in air pollution, more rapid decreases in greenhouse gas emissions, more rapid increase in access to clean water and sanitation. So in other words, the right to a healthy environment delivers on its promise of clean air, clean water, a safe climate, and better environmental conditions for people. And that's a really important take-home message. And in fact, in my most recent report to the United Nations, I compiled a set of what the United Nations describes as good practices in recognizing and implementing the fundamental human right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And by working with students and researchers all over the world, I was able to put together a good practices report that includes more than 500 examples gathered from more than 175 countries around the world of good practices in those procedural and substantive elements that I spoke about earlier. So examples from on the procedural side, 12 South Pacific nations have gotten together to put together an online portal that makes access to environmental information in their countries free, accessible, and useful for policymakers who have to submit reports on environmental progress. In Costa Rica, they have a terrific system of access to environmental justice, where they have an ombudsperson who can receive complaints, they have a specialized environmental tribunal that can receive complaints, and their constitutional court has adjudicated quite a few cases involving the constitutional right to a healthy and ecologically balanced environment, which is Article 50 of Costa Rica's constitution. And then some countries like Finland and Norway have actually got mechanisms put in place to ensure that children and youth are involved in environmental and climate change decision making in those countries. On the substantive side, we're seeing a lot of progress in terms of clean air. Countries like France that have actually recognized the right to clean air in its environmental legislation and are putting in place stronger regulations to achieve clean air for all of its citizens. In terms of a safe climate, incredible progress in some countries. In the United Kingdom, Czechia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and others, greenhouse gas emissions are down more than 30% since 1990. A growing number of countries are getting between 98 and 100% of their electricity from renewable energy sources. That includes Albania, Costa Rica, Uruguay, Paraguay, Norway, Namibia, and Iceland, among others. And there has been an explosive growth in the last 20 years in renewable electricity generation. So in today, there's about 60 times as much wind electricity being produced globally as there was in the year 2000. And there's about 600 times as much solar electricity being generated globally than there was just 20 years ago. So these are encouraging good practices in terms of the safe climate as an element of the right to a healthy environment. In terms of healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, of course, there's not all good news, but at least 40 countries have now protected more than 25% of their national land area in national parks and other forms of protected reserves, where the interests of nature should be put ahead of human interests. In terms of access to clean water and sanitation, we've seen over the last 20 years, hundreds of millions of people gain access to clean drinking water. In Paraguay, for example, in South America, where there used to be a huge gap between urban residents and rural residents in terms of access to safe drinking water, in the year 2000, only half of rural residents had access to safe drinking water. Today, over 99% of rural people in Paraguay have access to safe drinking water. In terms of healthy and sustainably produced food, we've seen progress in terms of the phase out of some particularly nasty pesticides, led by France, the first country to ban all of the bee-killing neonicotinoid pesticides. In terms of non-toxic environments, we have seen a growing number of countries taking strong action to address plastic pollution, more than 50 countries that have phased out all uses of asbestos, and of course, many countries that are phasing out persistent organic pollutants pursuant to obligations under the Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants. So all of those examples indicate that progress is possible, and these are good practices that should be emulated and taken up by other countries all around the world. All of these reports, I should say, are available on my website, which is www.srenvironment.org. and also on the official website of Special Rapporteurs at www.ohchr.org. So, as we stand today, as I mentioned at the outset, we do face a global environmental crisis, but what's encouraging to me is the power that human rights have to play in solving these challenges. If we took a rights-based approach to climate change, as I called for in my report on a safe climate, if we took a rights-based approach to biological diversity, to its conservation and sustainable use, then without question, we would be making much faster progress towards attaining the UN's 2030 Sustainable Development Goals and transforming society to make us a healthier, wealthier, cleaner, and happier society. So I thank you for taking the time to listen to me today. I look forward to hearing more about the work that you are doing to protect the people and the places that we love. And thank you so much for the work that you do on behalf of this beautiful blue-green planet. Thank you very much, and take care.
Okay, we thank you very much, David Boyd, although you're not present to respond to questions that we will have later on. But I will introduce the next speaker, which is Matilda Månsson. Welcome to this session. You're a legal advisor, but you're also serving as the coordinator of international affairs at the Sami Parliment. And you're also part of the Swedish delegation negotiating the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity. So I'm so happy that you can join us today, because you're also representing one of the groups that David is talking a lot about, the indigenous people and their important role. So I would like to leave the floor to you first to give a short introduction from your perspective, and we'll follow up with a discussion linking yours and David's presentation. So please, Matilda.
Thank you so much, and I'm very happy to be invited to take part in this course, which is, as Karin was mentioning in the beginning, linking the nexus of human rights and environment. The Sami people are an indigenous people in Sápmi, which are covering Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Russia. And the Sami Parliament in Sweden, which was established through the Sami Parliament Act in '93, is the popularly elected representative body of the Sami people in Sweden. And the parliament also functions as a government agency on Sami issues. And the overall task is to advocate, promote, and protect Sami rights and interests in order to ensure their economic, social, and cultural development. So referring to what Boyd was outlining, the right to a clean, safe, and healthy and sustainable environment, information and participation in decision-making are key roles to achieve this. And this is what we work a lot at the Sami Parliament, with the overarching goal to achieve self-determination for the Sami people. And this is also what is constituting a lot of my role and my work as a coordinator of international affairs and cooperation at the Sami Parliament, where I work a lot with international issues covering environment, climate, and indigenous rights. And what we do is to try to monitor the development of international law and support the national implementation in Sweden. So I would like them to try to place indigenous peoples in the context of the rights to environment and put then a special emphasis on biodiversity. And this is so that we all can understand why indigenous peoples play a key role in the protection of biodiversity and why their full and effective participation must be ensured in these processes. So I would like to highlight indigenous peoples in three roles. Firstly, indigenous peoples are rights holders, and secondly, they are stewards of the land, and thirdly, indigenous peoples are knowledge holders. As was highlighted by the Special Rapporteur, states do have additional obligations with respect to members of certain groups, and this was also what Maria was just mentioning, and indigenous peoples are one of those groups. So what are then these additional rights apart from the right to environment, and where can they be found? Usually we mainly refer to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the key instrument to outline indigenous peoples' rights. And there we talk about the right to self-determination, which constitutes also the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, and the right to consultation and full and effective participation in matters of concern. Another key field is the land use and land tenure rights, and also cultural rights. The rights to maintain different practices, customs, languages, livelihoods, and traditional knowledge. So I will give you one example from Article 25 of the UN Declaration, and that reads, "Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters, and coastal seas, and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations in this regard." So this article very much highlights the importance of indigenous people's spiritual attachment to their lands and their right to pursue practices and traditions associated with that spiritual relationship. It recognizes the responsibility to ensure that future generations too can maintain such a relationship. And through this article, we can see that a human rights-based approach clearly shows the interlinkages between nature, people, and culture. So indigenous peoples as steward and having this relation to the land, it makes it clear that land is not just even primarily an economic asset. It is the defining element of their identity and culture and their relationship to their ancestors and future generations. So as was mentioned, land rights are transgenerational, and they carry an obligation of stewardship for the benefit of present and future members of the community on the basis of their continued existence as a people. So in the understanding of land and nature among indigenous peoples, the rights to use the land is inseparable from the obligation of caring for the land. So this again illustrates the reciprocal and symbiosis relationship between nature and people, and that is why the role of indigenous peoples as stewards is key. The customary use of the land, nature, and biodiversity becomes a way of also protecting the very same. The IPBES platform that Boyd also referred to has some key findings that highlights this. Indigenous people steward 80% of the world's biodiversity, despite comprising only 5% of the world's population. Nature is generally declining less rapidly in indigenous people's lands than in other lands, and at least a quarter of the global land area is traditionally owned, managed, used, or occupied by indigenous peoples. Governance, including customary institutions and management systems, which Boyd was also referring to, and other co-management regimes that involve indigenous peoples, can be an effective way to safeguard nature by incorporating these local management systems and indigenous knowledge. And indigenous peoples as knowledge holder is the third role I would like to highlight. In the Sami context, arbevirolas mahtu, or arbediettu, is what we call traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge systems or ways of knowing. And indigenous knowledge is so important, and we need to recognize these knowledge and innovations and practices and the values of indigenous peoples and ensure their inclusion in the participation in environmental governance. And this doing so often enhances indigenous peoples' quality of life, but also the conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of nature, which is relevant to broader society. Indigenous knowledge on agriculture, aquaculture, and livestock systems, and the safeguarding of native species, varieties, and breeds and habitats, and ecological restoration can help achieve not only biodiversity protection and sustainable use, but also food security. So I would like to give you a Swedish example of where the Sami indigenous knowledge is key. We have developed in the Sami Parliment, together with reindeer herding communities, reindeer management plans. These document the different ways that land is used in reindeer husbandry. For example, grazing lands, migration routes, difficult passages and more key areas to reindeer herding. And in addition, these plans describe external factors and other land use, for example, forestry, other infrastructure, agriculture, climate, and weather. And in addition, the documentation is also combined with GPS information from reindeer. So the management plans illustrate the land use and the green infrastructure of reindeer husbandry based on the reindeer herders' traditional knowledge. And as such, it compiles an overarching tool that can be used for land use planning or in environmental permitting to understand the importance of these lands. So what does these three roles mean and what I just mentioned? I would like to give you all, before we go into the discussion, some main takeaways to consider. What I think is important is that we need to understand and make better use of the interlinkages between nature and culture, between biological and cultural diversity and their interdependence, and to not separate people and planet, people and nature. And therefore, we also needed more differentiated and more holistic understanding of what nature and environmental protection is, to understand that ensuring the continuation of indigenous customary sustainable use and the recognition of indigenous people's rights, including land tenure rights, actually means protecting nature. And we need to move focus from conservation and traditional regimes of national parks and strict protected areas and accept other concepts of protection, for example, indigenous and community conserved areas. We also need increased knowledge. We need to know about indigenous peoples. We need to know about their rights, about their livelihoods, and how they are key players in policy making and management. So I would like to just stop there, and then we can have a discussion about indigenous people's role in an international context, but also nationally. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matilda. Really interesting, and also interesting to get the Swedish perspective of the Sami people. We are often talking globally about indigenous people, but less frequently in this context about the Swedish indigenous people group. I was keen to ask you a question. David, as well as you, are talking about how environmental rights and human rights are interlinked. But there are several rights to consider. And I think right now we also experience a pandemic with lockdown, with a tougher climate for actually taking part in decisions from the most marginalized groups, like indigenous people globally. Because life doesn't stop, activities doesn't stop, meaning that extraction and logging and mining, etc., is continuing. From your perspective, what do you think are the most relevant or most central rights to focus on in that context in order to actually keep on striving for merging environmental and human rights?
Mm. Yeah, I think the IPES makes this quite clear that it is about how we use the land, and to not just see that nature is something undisturbed or something pristine without people, without human beings. So I think in that regard, it is very important to acknowledge then the land tenure rights and also the customary rights. So in protecting land rights and recognizing that indigenous peoples have the right to their lands in itself means, according to the IPES findings, that we will also have an increased protection of biodiversity because of the ways indigenous peoples live in harmony with nature.
And I'm also keen on following up on that, because David, as an environmental lawyer, he clearly stresses in his speech that if we have a rights-based approach to, for example, biodiversity, we will have much faster progress. And we know we're all running out of time. What do you think are the main reasons? Why are not indigenous people's knowledge and rights acknowledged to the same extent that it should be? Because scientific reports, policy recommendations all points at the same direction, that we have to have a full and participatory process which includes indigenous people in decisions that actually concerns environmental decisions, it concerns land, it concerns exploitation or not exploitation, but still it's not acknowledged. From your perspective, why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think that is a very complex question that can be answered in different aspects. I mean, of course, what I mentioned and what David is also mentioning, the aspect of knowledge is of course key. We need to have the knowledge about these rights regimes in order to also recognize and protect them. But I think another aspect that we see in many countries, and especially now also during the COVID pandemic, is the conflicts within land use. So indigenous peoples' lands usually coincide with other resources. So we have forestry, or we have mining, or in Sapmi we have wind power that needs to be established in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the climate targets and the Paris Agreement. So of course these create different conflicts that, okay, we are an exporting nation, or we have these other financial or commercial interests that oftentimes collide with the interests of indigenous peoples to maintain their lands. So I think that is another aspect as well.
Do you see a window of opportunity now when we are negotiating a new framework for the Convention on Biodiversity, for getting these opinions into the new framework?
Yeah, I think both, because we have seen also in many places of the world right now that also the situation has been used in order to override the rules of indigenous peoples in the Amazon. And also we have had difficulties with reindeer herders wanting to cross borders between Norway and Sweden, for example, in order to conduct reindeer herding. So but at the same time, I do think that the situation has made people aware of that decision making and also the implementation of decisions can be quicker and stronger than a lot of people thought was possible. That you speak in terms of, after this there is not a word called impossible anymore, because we are forced to reach out for new solutions or to find other ways of conducting business as usual. And I think that is very much what the negotiations on international level in the Convention on Biodiversity is trying to achieve. We talk a lot about transformative change, and that is very much hopefully what this pandemic also can help us achieve.
Yeah, you're right. And Sweden is known for being very inclusive, protective of rights, promoting participation in different processes. We even have the ombudsman, which we exported globally now, as a very key function for people to make their voice heard. What is your opinion in relation to the Sami people and the Swedish context? Are we lagging behind in that context? Because we're also very active in the global arena in promoting rights and a rights-based approach.
Yes, Sweden is a very important actor in the international arena, and also in the EU context. Sweden is very much a country that is encouraging the EU to be strong and having the lead position in advancing human rights and environmental protection. And I do think it's always difficult to talk about who is more progressive or who achieved the most, because there are always shades. So if we talk about indigenous people's rights, for example, of course, the Sami people are not facing forced displacements or disappearances or persecution of indigenous and environmental rights defenders, as is the case in many other countries. But however, the rate of hate crimes and hate speech, for example, towards or against the Sami has increased, and also the UN monitoring bodies is critiquing Sweden and makes it clear that there is still some cleaning up to do in our own backyard, so to say. But I think it's more a lack of knowledge, because I do think, and we do recognize, that there is a lot of political will in Sweden among politicians, but also once you meet people in management positions within the public governance system, it is clear that it's more about the lack of knowledge, that mostly people know more about indigenous peoples in other countries than about the Sami, and that there's been this domestic colonization with displacements and forced assimilation and so on. So the historical injustices, they are still to a great extent unknown in Sweden. But since we have such a strong policies on foreign aid and on foreign policy in general, I think that is the opportunity, once we start to recognize that human rights issues and indigenous rights issues are not something that belongs outside of Sweden, that there's something happening in other countries that is also something we can work with on a national level as well, then we have all the tools and we have the political will in order to do so.
Yeah, and do you feel that the process now with CBD is promising? We are facing kind of close down for the processes, but it will still continue. We are heading towards a new framework. There's a lot of work being done from many different types of civil society organizations globally. Do you feel it's promising now that we actually, despite the pandemic, but it might also open up for a transformative change, as you were saying before?
Yes, definitely. And I do think that the CBD is a good example of how this interlinkages and the nexus of environment and human rights have come closer, and also in regarding and respecting indigenous people's knowledge and their key role in safeguarding biodiversity. I think that we see during the years that I have been following these international processes, but also on a national level, we see how indigenous peoples have a stronger role in the international organizations. And there is a process now, part of this setting up this post-2020 framework to also safeguard or create a stronger framework for indigenous peoples within this context. And that is a parallel negotiations that is ongoing to how to secure a permanent body of some sort that will ensure the participation of indigenous peoples and make sure that traditional knowledge is part of the decision-making process and not just science as has been for a long time. So I think the international negotiations on the CBD is a good example of how we can see a progressing future.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Matilda. We will discuss further on during this morning session about specifically CBD and how it goes with the negotiations, but we will also discuss some of the tools that might be needed to emphasize on in order to steer towards environmental and human rights and secure biodiversity at the end of the day. So I'm really grateful you can join us and wish you all good luck. And we also thank David Boyd, and I think he would have loved to take part in the discussion, but he will follow us over YouTube. So thank you so much, Matilda.
Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah, and now we're going to have 10 minutes break, and we will continue after this session with a session specifically talking about different views on the CBD process. We will talk about the international negotiations on biodiversity, but we will also invite that from an indigenous people's perspective, from the youth perspective, and also from the government perspective. So please join us, 10:10. Oh, sorry. 10 o'clock, sorry. So join us 10 past. You have missed 10 minutes of a very interesting discussion, so 10.
Okay. So, welcome back to this webinar with the session that will focus on international negotiations and in particular the Convention on Biodiversity. And as mentioned earlier this morning, international agreements and regulations are important in order to halt the loss of biodiversity and also to secure human rights. The Convention on Biodiversity is actually the sister to the Convention on Climate. They are both children of the Rio Conference in 1992 on environment and development. And the Biodiversity Convention is very often referred to as the CBD, so this is what you will hear throughout this session. It is a very important vehicle for halting the loss of biodiversity, but it is less well known than the Climate Convention. And in order to perhaps raise the understanding of the importance of the convention, we think it would be important to give a background to where it came from and where it is right now. And therefore, we will begin this session with a brief background and description on the state of the art of the current negotiations. And then we will discuss important aspects for a strong framework on biodiversity, on environment and people. And with me in this session, I have Charlotta Sörqvist, who is Senior Advisor at the Swedish Ministry of Environment. She's also Sweden's Chief Negotiator to these negotiations, and you're also the chair of the CBD subsidiary body of implementation. We will also listen to Nonette Rojo, who is Executive Director of the 10-year facility, and she will talk to the important issues on the rights of indigenous people and local communities and their important role in protecting biodiversity and the important role of traditional knowledge. And we will also hear from Gustav Zachrisson, who represents the Youth Biodiversity Network and who will speak to the importance of having youth perspective in the negotiations. So by this very short and brief introduction, I would like to leave over for you, Charlotta, to give us a background to the Convention on Biodiversity and also to give us a glimpse on where things are now, in particular as we feel a little bit worried about where things are caused by due to the pandemic and the situation around that. So please, Charlotta.
Yes, thank you, Karin. Thank you for the introduction and good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today and be able to discuss a little about the international negotiations on biodiversity. I think you all know heard about the ongoing crisis on biodiversity loss, that biodiversity is declining globally. And as you all are aware of, we all depend on biodiversity and healthy ecosystems for our health and survival. And therefore, it is so important that we also cooperate on a global level, not only work on national level, of course, that is important, but this is a global crisis. We need to cooperate, and therefore we do have international treaties working on how to tackle this huge crisis. CBD is one very important vehicle, and that's what I will tell you a little about today. Next slide, please. First, maybe just as a brief background, that since 1970s, there has been a momentum how to tackle environmental problems on international level. And that has led that you have adopted a number of international agreements. But first, it was more focused on sectoral issues, like focus more on specific problems like CITES about trade of endangered species or Ramsar Convention about wetlands. But then that come more growing understanding that you need to have a more holistic approach. So that's why I decided to also negotiate a more framework convention that is more like an umbrella convention. And UN Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, as I said, it's an international legal treaty. 196 parties, governments has agreed to follow this treaty, and we very often says it's one of the 3 Rio Conventions that entered into force in 1993. That means that it was established at the Rio Summit together with the Climate Change Convention and the Convention about combating desertification. So these 3 Rio Conventions also have very common ways how to work, like framework conventions. And what does it really mean that it's a framework convention? It means that it covers, in this sense, it covers all ecosystems. It's not only some specific areas, it covers everything. And has 3 main objectives: the conservation of biological diversity. The second one is to ensure sustainable use of biodiversity in its components. And the third one, to ensure fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from utilization of genetic resources. And these 3 main objectives, of course, needs to be translated into national policies. So next slide, please. So this framework convention is our overarching framework, general principle of taking basic commitments. But the parties to the convention meets every second year and negotiate and adopt decisions to make it more specific, to get clearer guidance how to work. And the next meeting will be, as I think Karin mentioned in the beginning of this session, that this year was supposed to be the super year of biodiversity, and we will have a meeting in Kunming in October. That meeting, unfortunately, had been postponed due to a crisis, but the next meeting will be next year in Kunming, China. So those meetings, conference of parties every second year, is very important because you take decisions on how to work further to make better commitments. And it has been, since the beginning of the convention has entered into force, we have worked also to take specific strategic plans with more specific targets, and it will be easier for the parties and countries to follow. Next slide, please. And the current strategic plan, maybe you've heard about the ET targets. The current strategic plan was adopted 2010. It covers the period up to this year, 2020, and it has 20 global targets. But all parties has committed that they should translate those targets and into the national plans and strategies. But unfortunately, even if I think it's a very, very ambitious strategic plan, and the targets in many ways are very good, it has not really come so far as we hoped. And we have to work and make more together. Some targets maybe have come closer to others, but for some targets we're not far away from fulfilling them. And biodiversity loss is still continuing. So there we are now in the situation that even if we have a very, in many ways, good targets, we have not come so far. We need to do more. Next slide, please. So we have now, I think since 2018, have a process to try to develop a new framework that will come and replace the current strategic plan. And this new framework, we have, of course, our experiences and lessons from the last years. We know that we had maybe done good progress in some areas, but not as good as we hoped. We know that we have scientists telling us that biodiversity loss is, the decline is continuous, and we do have a huge problem. So we need to also to give a new ambitious framework, new targets that will guide us in the coming years. And we also have another thing, we do have a sustainable development goals, and we need HAMSA to see how they can work together, and so we can all have a good outcome in the end. Next slide, please. So this new strategic plan will replace the current strategic plan, the new global targets on biodiversity. We have a special negotiation group that will negotiate that to open and working group post 2020. And we have had and will have discussion on global, regional, and also thematic consultations. And the hope is that they will adopt the next year at COP15. Next slide, please. So, what is discussed? I think we have already one first proposal for a new framework, what we call zero draft. And in that zero draft, there is proposals on targets. So that means reducing threats to biodiversity. And those targets, for instance, could be that you have figures for protected areas. It could also be targets on how to reduce pollution or other threats, invasive alien species, and other threats for biodiversity. So there is a group of targets that you want to focus on those threats. But there is also a group of targets that are more linked to the meeting people's needs. And here you talk very much about sustainable use and then benefit sharing. And one example is targets for enhanced nutrition, like the ecosystems that biodiversity give mankind, like enhanced nutrition, it could be urban biodiversity, nature-based solutions, the linkages to climate, and other kind of targets. And in this group of targets, you also see very much linkages to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And then you have a third group about tools and solutions. That's more about how to, for instance, reform economic sectors, how can increase resources, capacity building. So we have had a first discussion on those targets, and there are of course a lot of ideas on how you can formulate it. And we had that discussion in February this year in Rome. And then, as you know, we have not the possibility to meet. So we are now in a period when we try to continue our discussions on those targets, but we also have a period when we cannot meet physically, but we try to do it more or less online and hope that we will meet quite soon again. Next slide, please. So, next step. There is online discussions on specific items. For instance, there is right now an online discussion on capacity building. There has been another online discussions. There is plans that you might have possibility to have virtual webinars and discuss. But the next step is that there will be meeting, and now I put a question mark because it's very unsure anything, in October about the scientific parts of the framework and also about subsidiary part of implementation, about enhanced implementation. And hopefully we'll have those meetings in October. And then the next meeting with specific open-ended work group post 120 could be maybe in December or January, when we will have a new draft, a new targets to discuss. And eventually everything will be decided at COP15 next year. So that's our plan right now. We have had a long period of discussions already. We have come quite far, but I would say that even if we can see more or less what the components of a new framework look like, it is a huge work ahead of us, and we need to keep momentum in the discussion, even though we all struggle with the pandemic and the difficulties to meet each other. But it is so important to somehow come and keep momentum discussions, so we together can come with a new framework that will guide us and give us the good vehicles to work and to halt biodiversity loss. And I have put a link here for the website. The CBD Secretary has a special website for post-2020 framework. You can look, and you want to have more information, you can look there. But I would like to end just saying that even if we have good targets in the end, even if we have conclude next year on a good new framework, the targets will never be reached without serious engagement on most society stakeholders. And therefore, you all are very, very important in this process as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlotta. It's great to have you with us, and thank you for a very informative and useful introduction to this discussion. And we will come back to you later on in the session to perhaps raise a few issues around the possibilities to push for strong targets still. And I'd like to remind you all who are listening and watching this that it is possibilities to send in questions. We will come to that later on in this session. But before that, I will turn to Nonette Rojo for answering a few questions. And just before giving you the floor, I'd like to remind us about that in the previous session, we heard about the importance to manage issues around environment, biodiversity, and human rights in an integrated manner. And this is true, not the least when it comes to the CBD and the CBD frameworks and decisions. So, turning to you, Nonette, I'd like to begin by asking you what will be needed in order to secure that indigenous people and local communities will be part of shaping the new framework of the CBD. And what are the lessons learned from previous experiences on this?
Thank you, Karin. What's needed? The tenure facility is, I'm speaking as an institution that enables indigenous peoples and local communities to speak out. It's a rights institution. It supports land rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. And the relationship between people who have rights, especially indigenous peoples and local communities, and their voicing of their position in international negotiations is very important. So for the CBD, it's important that they are maintained as actors and as contributors to the shaping of the strategy into the future. The lessons so far have been that for us, for those that support rights, and it has been repeated by Matilda, rights protect nature. So rights enable people and rights enable culture and the interconnection between these three. So the important lesson from the tenure facility really is when you get collective rights recognized, then the community groups, local and indigenous, are able to engage at all levels. So they don't just negotiate at their level, at the village, at their district and provinces, but they also negotiate nationally and internationally. In Sweden in 1972, there were already Hopis and Navajos participating. And that just continued. In fact, that time I read about how the Swedish government accepted their own passports. You know, they were self-determined representations at that time. And it was maintained throughout, including up to now. The tenure facility enables and supports more of these voices in all the regions, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And that enables the expansion of the voicing of that guardianship of nature. And that guardianship is not realized fully if their rights are not recognized. And the CBD, because of the provisions on conservation, sustainable use, benefit sharing, and all the other implementation agreements is significant. It's very significant.
So far, with agreements that have been agreed upon in the past, I mean, what role has the CBD played, and what role would you hope it to play coming forward?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. In some of the countries that we support, primarily Indonesia, the Philippines, and there are 11 countries right now that were engaged. The national implementation of the CBD has transformed the opportunity of indigenous peoples to push for their collective guardianship of territory. So in Indonesia, for example, the environmental law that was driven upon the signing of the commitment to the CBD became one of the strongest foundations for pushing for co-management of territories, for a constitutional commission decision on ensuring that forests within the territory of indigenous peoples remain guarded by indigenous peoples. And it has also been the basis for other implementing agreements, otherwise difficult, just by law on strict law on land titling. So this law is on co-management and co-stewardship based on traditional knowledge. So what has slowly advanced strictly on just land rights recognition has advanced further when it came to protecting the environment and ensuring that the traditional actors, traditional knowledge holders are able to do that. So there's a parallel, and it's really helped in the engagement at the local level and at also the government and the local and indigenous peoples as well. Yeah.
Thank you. That is really encouraging, and it also tells us how important it will be with the future framework that is also including the role of indigenous people and local communities. So we will really have to push for that dimension coming forward. I will come back to you later on, but I also like to include Gustav in our discussion. And Gustav, you are representing a youth network. And I mean, we have seen when it comes to the climate issues that the youth have been really important in pushing for stronger targets and really also been the sort of catalyst for a greater engagement in the climate issues. So far, we haven't seen that as much with biodiversity, but I'd like to ask you to reflect a bit on why is it so important that young people engage in the biodiversity issues, and what do you hope for the negotiations coming from a youth perspective?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think, as you mentioned, the climate issue has brought attention among youth, and I hope at least that there's just a matter of time, and when biodiversity also becomes a more question that youth care about, because at least for me it started as a general interest in the environmental issues, but then the understanding that biodiversity is so broad, so complex, that it kind of encompasses all the environmental issues. So I think that is why youth needs to be more engaged in biodiversity, and especially when we have these negotiations, which is important because it's a new framework that will be for the next 10 years, which are crucial for the planet. I think that youth needs to be active, we need to be there, and we need to get our voices out, because in some way what will be the results of this framework and its implementation will be the planet that we will live on, the nature that we will use and live with. So it's sort of, we don't own it yet, but we will own it, and therefore we should have a voice in these negotiations.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I totally agree, and I can also see that for instance, Fridays for Future, they are also talking about biodiversity loss. So I wouldn't like to portray it like there are two different communities. In fact, I see they are very much connected. I think this is how you are working, and these are the two sort of very important crises that we have faces, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, and they are of course very much connected in many different ways and needs to be solved also in an integrated way. So thank you for that, Gustav. Is there anything that you'd like to ask Charlotta? Now you have the possibility. She's the chief negotiator, you know, so she's a woman of power.
Of course, as coming of a youth network, we are several environmental organizations for youth in Sweden, and we're starting to be more engaged in the CBD processes. And of course, I would like to ask you, Charlotta, if you have any plans for involving youth and what the Swedish views are on how youth can be more included in the global framework progress.
So that is one question for you, Charlotta. I also let Nonette have the possibility to put a question to you, Charlotta, and then I will put one myself. But it's nice to have an interactive dialogue. So Nonette, is something you'd like to pose to Charlotta?
Yeah, Charlotta, the negotiation group, what would you encourage, what would you say to the indigenous groups that are broader than those that are talking in the negotiations to forward their inputs in terms of making sure that they are protected, the biodiversity guardianship processes that are done in a collective way are carried over to these negotiations, especially in protecting the traditional knowledge holders, especially in this period.
So I turn to you, Charlotta, for these two questions to begin with. And you will have a possibility now to revert, so that if you have questions for Gustav and Nonette, that's also a possibility after you have responded to their questions.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for good questions. First, about the question about youth. As you said, Gustav, I think the youth perspective is so important in these negotiations. Actually, we're talking about your future, and we do need to have your perspective. And I'm very happy that in the CBD convention negotiations, I think the youth movement has been very present and has been able to participate in different ways. Now, coming to Sweden, I think that we do have. It's good that we have had those dialogues that has been taken care. As we have in the Nordic Council of Ministers has a special program for youth dialogues in all Nordic countries, and I'm very happy that it had been possible to have it also in Sweden, and I hope that we can take care of the views coming from that dialogue, and hopefully we can have more dialogues in the time to come. And as I see it, I mean, we will have discussions later on, of course, about the delegations at the coming meetings, but hopefully we can find a way that we can have also a youth perspective more in our delegation. But we'll see. We will see later on when we decide about the delegation as such. And then to your question on that, and I think it's a difficult one, but very valid. Well, as you know, first, I think Matilda has already told you said a little about it, but I mean, indigenous peoples and local communities have a unique relationship with biodiversity, as you say, and also have a special role in the CBD negotiations. There are several articles in the CBD that directly refer to indigenous peoples and local communities, and on these negotiations we have always talk about the importance to involve the indigenous peoples and local communities. But even if we talk about it, we also need, of course, as you say, not only talk to those people that are able to come to a negotiation, but also the other ones. And there I think that all civil organizations and organizations working with indigenous people and local communities has a big role also to serve as a bridge from the negotiators to the people concerned. And as I said before, even if we have good targets and try to involve, in the end we also need to have a good implementation, and you have to make a translation in the national policy, and that will be very important that we do have as good text in the framework that make linkages to specific role and rights of indigenous people and local communities. So I hope that you and others will help us, so we will have a right text, so it could be then translated in the national policy in a good way. So I will leave that question to you, Nonette, if you have any specific ideas about in these negotiations how we can, in a better way than maybe as done before, to involve that perspective.
You're thinking about that, Annette. I'd like to also raise some questions to you, Charlotta. It's really true that many people and many countries are looking at Sweden at this situation, not only for our particular Swedish model, but also with the hope that Sweden will insist on ambitions and targets that are sort of in the level of what is required when it comes to biodiversity. And of course, there is a fear that discussions around resources will lead to lowered ambitions. So I'd like to ask you, what is your sense? I mean, is Sweden pushing, for instance, for certain figures on protected areas? That is one of the issues that is being discussed right now. And how do you feel that the discussion has sort of been carried forward throughout the pandemic? You mentioned all these different meeting points, and you said that there are still discussions going on. A second question would be, how much do you feel this is linked to the negotiations on the EU biodiversity strategy? So to conclude, just to tell you again that you know that people are looking at Sweden hoping that you will really keep the flag and being the frontier of fighting for a good outcome of the COP15. And then, for instance, this will be measured on targets like the figure on protected areas and so forth. So there is one particular issue to you. Maybe it's too early to respond to that one. But overall, what is your sense, and how much can you push at this moment of time?
Yes, thank you very much for your questions. Well, I think that if you start with the sense about the pandemic, I think that it's quite clear the interlinkages, but the nature does play a part in everybody's life. That it has been mentioned, of course, that the section on biodiversity might be one reason behind the pandemic. The land degradation, wildlife, trade has connections. So to start saying that, we do really hope that even if I understand that for many countries the priorities might change, still the issue is really valid. We do need to work to have protected biodiversity. We need healthy ecosystems for our survival. So my hope that we will build back better, that we and that Sweden will have a strong voice in this, that we cannot just focus on the crisis right now. We have to see the reasons behind the need to have a safe world, that we do need to continue to have a strong framework so we can also safeguard for coming crises. That's one thing. And then, as you know, of course, we do have discussions. Sweden is one of the European Union group. We do discuss and have common positions in negotiations. But I think that we have tried to have we will continue to have a high ambition. We want to have a high ambition for this new framework. We want to make sure that ambition absolutely is not lowered. But we need to maybe to learn from what we have from the current stage plan. We have a better implementation. And how can that be done? One way to have a better accountability and have a helpful implementation. We can have better monitoring systems. That could be one way. We have also worked and tried to see if we can see interlinkages with climate change, and we need to see that biodiversity and climate is interlinked. We have also advocated that there are some areas that we maybe don't think that has been really covered in the current state plan. We need to talk more about freshwater. That's one area where I think Sweden has advocated that we need to have more specific target. I think it's also now in the zero draft, and also that you do have. We need to have maybe talk about the healthy, the urban biodiversity and the biodiversity's role for have a good health. But you also ask about the protected areas. Of course, that it will be important, will always be important to talk about protected areas and figures about that. As you say, Sweden has, we have supported to have a global target on marine areas. When it comes to land, we are still considering and see where we will end in what we will discuss. We are still considering different targets, but it will be a help, of course. It will be interesting to see what this newly released strategy from the European Commission on biodiversity, how that will how a discussion will go within the European Union. Because the next time we do have negotiations will be the next open-ended working group, hopefully in the end of this year. And then I think we will have a possibility to show leadership. And that's my hope, we will do that.
So at least you will have support by the environment movement if you're pushing for
yes.
tough targets, because we have welcomed the Commission's
and that I think is very welcome, yeah.
Yes. So I understood that, yeah, Nonette is back. I heard you had some troubles. This is how we have it now with the corona pandemic. We are struggling with technique all day long. But good that you're back, Nonette. So Nonette, would you like to respond to Charlotta's question back to you? If there are any particular suggestions you would have for a better inclusion? That might also be a question for Gustav. I'm coming to you after Nonette, Gustav.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Charlotta. It's very clear to us that we need to work together. Because there are so many lessons out there in the front lines where nature is still interconnected directly with humans that are guardians. And we can't all be there. So what's important is for us here, the Tenure Facility is just one among many in Sweden. And there are, I realize, just within Sweden and in Scandinavia, are large reach to all of those territories out there where indigenous peoples and local communities are working with civil society here in Sweden. And so what's important then, as you actually suggested, Charlotta, is that there is this bridging where some of these voices that we already know, we hear them because we work with them, are collected, are pooled in some way and provided actively as an input to the negotiation group, and that we know it's not easy because we have to use acceptable language, we have to negotiate every word, but we don't lose the meaning. When Matilda talked, we knew exactly the same kind of conversation happens in the Amazon, in Papua New Guinea, in PNG, in Indonesia. It's the same set of values, and those are really important to be heard. And if that directly, the community groups collectively protecting those in the front lines are not able to speak about those, then we are the ones that each other are supposed to voice that in this process. And it's important because the translation of that happens nationally. And so we kind of, the active feedback loop, it's an active feedback loop that needs to happen, and that resourcing the civil society here, the work for environment is very important. It remains equally as urgent right now in the pandemic as any time in history. So that's how I think we can, and the youth included, and in fact, as actively, because they have all the, what's the word, idealism, energy, and reach, and daring. And so, yes, so that's what I think can be done, because not everyone can participate directly from the front lines. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can see that Charlotta is listening carefully to what you're saying. Then turning to you, Gustav, you've been listening for a while, and I'd like to ask you both if you have any particular suggestion to Charlotta, and also if they're looking at, for instance, the zero draft or the discussions that are on the table. Is there any particular issue that you'd like to push for or raise now that you have Charlotta in the same room?
Yeah, so I would say like the convention itself is open for several stakeholders to participate. So as Charlotte mentioned, the global youth movement have been very present in the negotiations. And what I could suggest and wish for the Swedish parts would be like to have a mechanism where youth are consulted. And as you mentioned, on the European level, since Sweden is part of the European Union and acts as one voice, it would be very interesting if youth can also be included in those discussions on the European level. And lastly, if there could be any formalized way that youth can be included in Sweden's contribution to this framework. For example, in the Climate Convention, you have a formalized way where youth are included as a representative, and it would be very interesting if we could do something similar for this way. But I know when it comes to the zero draft and the topics and the content of it, global youth are very active in the areas of equality, education, and what you call the enabling conditions. And especially like how can we implement this framework after it is set? Because it will be youth who are partly responsible to make it happen.
Maybe we can have a brief comment from Charlotte, and then I will turn to Victor for some questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you very much, Gustav, for those proposals. I think it's quite interesting to see if we can find a way to have a more formalized consultation, and hopefully the work that now has been done in the Nordic Council could serve as a model. So I would be interested to continue discussion with you about that. Thank you. And thank you very much also, Nonette, for your comments. I have taken very careful note of everything.
Great, thank you. Then I'll turn to you, Victor, and I'll ask you what questions you have received.
Yes, hi, thank you. We have a full amount of questions, which I also urge you to put on the YouTube channel, or you can also send them to the WhatsApp phone number, which we have posted in the YouTube channel. Or if you can't get through it all, you can post them to my Facebook account, which is also fine. I have one very interesting question to Nonette, which is, I believe the term of local communities is not so clearly defined. Does it refer to all people more or less, since we all live in kind of local communities, even in urban areas? And to what extent are people aware of being part of this group with certain rights? For instance, the group I work with, small-scale fishers, my sense is that they actually don't always feel part of the group of local communities, as referred to in the CBD. Indigenous people seem to be better organized and have better protection and their own declarations, etc., which is great, of course. But how can we strengthen also the right and awareness of the concept of local communities? So, Nonette.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really an ongoing conversation, even among us. We put emphasis on self-determined communities, and primarily and secondarily, it's also, and everyone can provide input for those working with local communities. It does not exclude anyone, even those organized in urban areas, but the emphasis for at least for the tenure facility is those in the rural areas that have been vulnerable and are excluded, or are organized along the lines of being farmers that are rights deprived, so land rights. But in terms of our experience and lessons, the interconnection of communities, indigenous and local, is very much a strength and a value. So in the pandemic, the fisher communities have actually provided a strong voice and position in bartering their fish with the rice and corn and squash from the indigenous communities, and had become such a prominent model in many parts of Southeast Asia that we're following right now. These types of self-determined, but also empowered in the sense that their territory is intact, or what they do is valued, continue. And the stronger the rights are, the better they are able to spell out their survival strategies, because they have land, they have territory, they have access to those resources. So to respond to your question, self-determined local communities is an open, to me, I would say it's open, but there are definitions depending on who you're working with. So there are farmers groups, fishers groups, and others. Yeah, even at the peri-urban areas and those in the fringes. So in the tenure facility, 50% of the world's land is occupied by indigenous peoples and local communities combined.
Okay, thank you very much. We also then have a question to Charlotta. Will the Swedish government take any specific actions to ensure civil society will have the possibility to participate in the upcoming negotiations, given the alarming trend of a shrinking civic space, where we see civil society organizations are being opposed by governments around the world?
Yes, thank you. I think that in the CBD negotiations, civil society is quite open negotiation. It is civil societies very often participate as observers, and they are, if you have experience for climate change, for instance, I think they are much more closed than has been in CBD. We have had a tradition of having more open and transparent negotiation in that sense. So I hope that those organizations that want to participate as observers are allowed to do that. There, of course, you have to. There, of course, a certain way how to do. You have to contact the secretariat of a CBD and to ask for accreditation and so on. But I think that up to now, I have a feeling that the civil society and organizations have been quite active, actually. But of course, saying that. You're also coming to, it is still a treaty that in the end will be signed and decided by governments. So even if, of course, we do have an open discussion, I think now we are in a negotiation mode. So the best way is also to all organizations to try to put their views to the governments to make sure they're taken into account. It's also a good way to doing it. But absolutely, I think it should be still continue like it is, that it should be an open and transparent process.
Okay, thank you. I think there's time for at least one more question, which is maybe directed to Charlotta, but anyone can feel free to answer. How do the discussions go in the different working groups when it comes to the urgent need to integrate human rights in the goals, targets, and indicators? And what are the main obstacles for fully building the framework of human rights and to ensure the full and equal participation of indigenous people and local communities? So the question is, how are we actually working to integrate human rights in the ongoing working groups connected to the negotiations?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yes, maybe you're the most suitable person.
Maybe I can start saying that, well, we are still on negotiation. So I think that is absolutely one thing that is under discussion, how it can be improved or more better defined or better mentioned. I do think that there has been a lot of proposals how to formulate targets, and when it comes to enabling conditions and all the decisions that will be somehow framing the targets, there will be, of course, continued discussion about the human rights aspect. But exactly how it will be, I try to see if I can remember exactly how discussion has been, but I can say for sure that it's very, it's on the discussion, absolutely. And maybe somebody else, I don't know if Gustav or Nanette have heard, can give more specific comments on that. But when it comes to indigenous peoples and local communities, as I think Matilda told you in her intervention, is a discussion in this process how to continue to make sure that the indigenous people and local communities having the voice in these discussions. It could be a permanent body or another permanent organization somehow to make sure that their perspectives is included. So there is very much, it will be a discussion on those recommendations coming from a certain working group on that are looking at those things. So it will be a continued discussion on this.
Okay, thank you. Time is running short, so I think we need to hand over to Karin, but we can also make some comments to the additional questions that we have on the YouTube channel. Karin, over to you.
So thank you, Victor. And I'd like to start by thanking Charlotta, Gustav, and Annette for great contributions. We could have continued discussed this for a very long time, I feel, but this is a good beginning and maybe a appetizer for the coming months on these issues. I'd also like to emphasize and try to get us all engaged now and to remind us all, turning back to what Charlotta was saying, that negotiations are going on. And sometimes we make the mistake that we think that we can sort of try to influence to the end of the negotiations. And I think it's really important that we engage now and that we try to learn from what is on the table, zero draft, whatever, and try to start really talking to our governments at this moment of time, because I think now is the time to really try to push for specific issues. It's going to be more difficult as closer we get to negotiations, even though there might be issues, there will be last resort issues, but really to encourage all of us to stay on our toes and be engaged and really see that this is really important, as we have heard. So thank you for listening, and thank you again, Charlotta, Gustav, and Nanette. We will have another 10 minutes break, and then we will start again at 11. And then we will discuss a very important issue around the business sector and human rights relating to biodiversity. So welcome back at 11 again, and thank you for listening to this session.
Hi and good morning, everyone. My name is Henrik Halvardsson. I am the policy coordinator for Concord Sweden. This session now is called Business, Human Rights and Biodiversity. How are they interlinked and what are the main concerns? So basically today we're going to raise a few questions and we'll try to answer them as well. Firstly, business activities may adversely impact on diversity and how this may in turn undermine the responsibility to respect human rights. Also, how can framework and regulations support to avoid this from happening? And thirdly, what is missing today? Are legally binding regulations needed? So in order to address these issues and possibly others, we have a distinguished panel consisting of Maria Rydlund, Senior Policy Officer at the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, Phil Bloomer, Executive Director for Business Center for Human Rights, and Ulrika Littman, Deputy Director Sustainable Business at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. A very welcome to all of you. I'll just briefly explain the setup of this session, these 50 minutes. We'll start with Maria. She'll have a few minutes to talk about why the link between corporations and biodiversity and why there is a demand for regulation. Then Philip will have 5, 7, 10 minutes to sort of look back, maybe 10 years ago, looking at the UN guiding principles and moving forward until today and talking about the urgency in getting some kind of regulation on board. Then Ulrika will finish off that segment talking about the Swedish government's perspective on business and human rights and the ongoing processes that the government is involved in. Then we'll have a panel discussion for about 15-20 minutes, and then we'll leave, I'd say, probably 10 minutes of questions and answers at the very end where the panelists can come in and address your questions. So let's keep this very simple. And once again, welcome to all the participants and the panelists, and a very special welcome to Maria, who will sort of kick us off.
Thank you so much, Henrik. Hi, everybody. I will give you a short introduction to why we have interlinkages between business, human rights, and biodiversity. And I will give it very brief and short. I will use the tropical forest as an example because it is a very relevant example in this context. So please follow me in my journey. So the main drivers of biodiversity loss is land use change and extractive industries, including deforestation. The 4 main sectors of products, commodities, are beef, soy, wood, and palm oil. They are causing the main deforestation that we see today. And we can use Brazil as an example, where the increase of deforestation is tremendous. During the last 12 months, we've lost more than 9,000 square kilometers, and that's just during 1 year. It has not decreased, rather it has increased the last months. At the same time, we have set a target in the Sustainable Development Goals. The target, or the goal 15.2, says that we're going to halt deforestation by 2020, and we are there. But unfortunately, we do not see the progress in that target. Logging, obviously logging in Sarawak. For those of you who are familiar with the tropical forest, you will see it's already been logged, this forest, and now it's even being clear-cut. Of course, that impacts biodiversity and people's livelihood. Palm oil. This is palm oil all the way to the horizon. And before that, it was forest, community forest, which was managed and used by communities. It was maybe arable land, farmers' food production area, with biodiversity, and for sustainable production, sustainable food production also, we need biodiversity. But this is a complete monoculture, and of course it impacts both on biodiversity and on people's livelihood. So are corporate doing nothing? No, of course not. Corporate are doing a lot. There's a number of voluntary commitments in order to just specifically halt deforestation. But do they work? Well, many companies have several commitments, as you see in this table, but still we are not near to reach the goal of halting deforestation by 2020, despite the ambitions, despite the initiatives, which are numerous. At the same time, land is alive. We know indigenous peoples are in the front line of defending biodiversity as they are defending their land and their territories. And we know also that roughly 35% of the global land belongs to indigenous communities. And at the same time, it contains high biodiversity, specifically also in terms of forest. The most biodiversity-rich forests are actually within indigenous peoples' territories. So why do we need to focus on business, environment, and human rights? Well, we see that many countries have a weak legislation. There is a huge presence of business, there's corruption, business influence policies, and at the same time we see that defending environment and defending land has become very, very dangerous to do. And why is that? Why do people put up barricades like the pennons in Sarawak? Why do companies invest in security forces? Well, there is a conflict on how to manage land and who has the last say. There's also an issue of how to get involved. The full and effective participation is often not possible for those who are actually the ones that are being most impacted by land use change. And sadly enough, we can see that a number of sectors are involved in killing of environmental rights defenders. And that includes agribusiness, forestry, mining, even dams and poaching. So these are really sad figures. And unfortunately, we don't see these figures being lowered. Actually, it's the opposite. So do we actually need to regulate? And how do we regulate? But what has been brought on the table is that we need a human rights due diligence. And that has a specific content. It's not something that you do once and leave it like that. It's a living process that you go through, that you document your activities as a business, that you document the processes you have, that you include relevant right holders and stakeholders, and that you also come up with remedy in those cases, that you actually are hold responsible for any activity that might impact negatively on people. We did a study, the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, together with Swedwatch on human rights due diligence. And we did that in Cameroon last year. And our finding was actually that even within the tropical forest, despite using voluntary schemes like the certification system, which are most famous maybe for forest and logging, Forest Stewardship Council, despite that scheme in place, there was still a number of abuses in relation to the local communities surrounding the concession where the logging took place. It also meant that we could not rely only on FSC, only on this voluntary certification scheme, because it wasn't enough. People were being severely affected, and in a long-term perspective as well. So I'll end with these words and hand over to our other panelists in order to dig deeper into how to go about it then. Thank you.
And please, the floor is yours. Or the microphone is yours.
Oh, hello. Good, thank you. First of all, sorry for being a minute late. I do apologize. It was something that I couldn't get away from. I wanted to start really by just saying a little bit more about what Maria said, because I think she's laid out a very useful framework for us to understand the fundamental indivisibility of human rights and environmental concerns. I don't believe they were ever properly, you could ever silo them into two separate categories, but human beings work in categories, and therefore we've tended to do that. But in reality, they are fundamentally interlinked. And now with the climate crisis, with the crisis of biodiversity, we have the only way in which we can attack climate change and biodiversity loss is by also integrating the human rights issues, and vice versa. The human rights issues cannot be changed without addressing fundamentally the climate crisis, which now has so many critical human rights impacts, as well as biodiversity loss, which Maria's just described, some of those extraordinary impacts on human rights that they have. Business plays a fundamental role in biodiversity loss, in the creation of the climate breakdown, and in human rights abuse. But they also must be part of the solution, because we're not going to get rid of them. So we've got to find ways in which we can help really support and redirect business into a much more responsible approach. Because the current approach of the majority of business is unsustainable and does not deserve to be sustained. And so we have to help business really move. Now, we will do that through various mechanisms, through, as Maria's pointed out, some of the leading businesses that now fully understand the importance of a responsible approach to the environment and to workers and communities that they rely on. But we will also need the regulatory standards that Maria also spoke about that lift the minimum floor of corporate behaviour and outlaw the extraordinary abusive business practices, which is the essential practice of the majority of business at the present time, where they are not regulated. So particularly in the global south, in places like the Cameroon. So I want to just spend a moment saying, from our perspective, and we take up 650 allegations of abuse a year from around the world. You know, we post over, we have a posting of about 18,000 different data points on corporate abuse and corporate advance. We see the fundamental drivers of abuse, environmental as well as human rights, as the inequality of power and wealth between the companies and the workers and communities on the one hand, and also the environmental drivers of climate change, biodiversity loss, and conflict over resources. So we have to find ways to address that profound, obscene inequality that's grown up, particularly over the last 40 years. And we have to do that by appealing to the best of business to really speak out. And now some businesses and investors are speaking out. There's over 1,000 companies and investors that have spoken out for a mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence law in the European Union. That's fundamentally important, because European commissioners are not going to shift just because people like me and the rest of civil society say, we need this thing now. They're used to us saying those things. Very important that we've got public opinion on our side, but it's also fundamentally important that we've got also some of the leading voices of business saying, we want a level playing field. We're sick of being undercut by bad business that will externalize their environmental costs. They will externalize their social costs and dump it onto somebody else to maximize their profit. And some of the leading businesses are now sick and tired of this arrangement because they're constantly being undercut. And so they are speaking out for mandatory human rights due diligence and environmental due diligence in order for them to feel like they're being treated fairly in the market. I wanted to then just say a little bit about the dynamics that go on regarding biodiversity and human rights. The poor and vulnerable, so business has exploited a huge amount of the world's resources already. We've sucked out the stuff that we wanted as hyper consumers. There are now a few areas left where there is still biodiversity. But business has already identified the profit opportunities in those biodiverse areas. The people living there tend to be the poorest and the most vulnerable people, precisely because they've been driven there by various dispossessions in the past. Indigenous people now inhabit the most infertile uplands, now good for wind power. They inhabit the most arid zones, now good for solar power. And so you can see the way in which these biodiverse regions, such as tropical forests, are now being essentially opened up and exploited. But of course, the poorest and the vulnerable need an enormous amount of support. It's not just going to be civil society exposing it, it's also going to be governments saying you have to, through mandatory human rights due diligence, as a company, you have to identify the human rights and environmental risks, and you have to seek to prevent them. Otherwise, you are exposed to massive legal risk. You are exposed to massive legal risk because if a case is taken against you, you will have no defense. And that's exactly as it should be. And so I applaud what's happening in the European Union at the moment, and I'm hoping that that will expand. We're already working in places like Kenya and Mexico on similar approaches to that law, so it can become international. And I'll finish just by saying, from my perspective, there is the voluntary approach that Maria spoke about has an incredibly important dynamic in the sense that it demonstrates from the best of business what is both a moral imperative of respect for human rights and environmental safeguards, but also what is commercially viable. Because if the best companies, and many of them are the most profitable, are making good money while respecting the environment and human rights, there's no reason why the majority of companies that are laggards in these two areas should not be doing the same thing. And so now the frustration that's been attached from investors, from governments, and indeed from leading companies, as well as civil society and the broad public, who've lost faith in global markets, that frustration with the glacial pace of implementation of human rights is now being expressed in mandatory human rights due diligence. And so that shift from voluntary to mandatory is fundamentally important, and we all need to support it, and particularly the integration of human rights and environmental due diligence so they walk hand in hand together over the next decade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. And good morning to Ulrika Lyckman from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And please tell us a bit more about the Swedish government perspective on business and human rights.
Thank you, Henrik, and good morning to you all. I would like to start by mentioning, except for the UN guiding principles, we also have the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, still voluntary, of course, but they include that companies are expected to carry out due diligence in respect to their environmental impacts, including climate change. And then also I would like to mention that Sweden supports by core funding the UN Global Compact organization, which supports companies all around the world to improve their skills and behavior within development, sustainable development. So I would like to paint a picture first, what is happening and what has been happening in Sweden, touching also upon the UN binding treaty that has been mentioned, and then ending with the scenario in the EU where there are a lot of a movement, where there is a lot of movement right now. So beginning with the situation in Sweden, according to the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights, you are recommended to produce a national action plan for business and human rights. And so far, I think there are only about, I don't know the exact number, but about 25 globally. And maybe 17 or 18 of the EU member states has one. The Swedish National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights was produced 2015. And then we had it evaluated by ourselves and also by our agency that scrutinize other governmental agencies the same year, 2018, and they left a lot of recommendation to the Swedish government in how we had implemented UN guiding principles. So last year, Sweden produced a new follow-up, so to speak, but more broadly action plan called the Platform for International Sustainable Business, where we, of course, have included environmental aspects, corruption, and so forth. So it's broader than the recommendation from the UN Guiding Principles. And we also have, maybe some of you have seen it, it's accessible on the governmental website, both in Swedish and in English, where we have also set targets or ambitions, what we have done and what we should be doing. So we will be measured according to this. We also have been involved in supporting other countries to produce this national action plan for business and human rights. So we have been given funding to UNDP, and they some of that went to Thailand, who actually produced their national action plan on business and human rights last year. And I would say that the process of producing this action plan is really crucial, not the least for the respect of the human rights, to include all the relevant stakeholders. So that's the process in itself. It's really important. Then the plan is another thing, but the process is really important. We have also been involved in the UN Forum for Business and Human Rights in Geneva. So last year, our Minister for Foreign Affairs, she was speaking on this issue. So we really have it on top of our agenda. And next week, as you might know, there will be another UNDP forum on business and human rights in Thailand, where our ambassador for sustainable business will be speaking, as well as the ambassador to Thailand. And he will be speaking exactly on the victims on human rights. Furthermore, we have the Swedish initiative called Drive for Democracy, and of course this is also related to human rights and anti-corruption. And this is also, we are also stepping up the efforts in this. So we will include more focus on anti-corruption or the fight against corruption and business and human rights issues. Touching upon the UN binding treaty, it is on its 6th year of negotiations, and there is a UN working group for this, where we have been really involved. We have also participated in peer learning exercises to share our experiences. We have put forward our comments to the report that will be presented this summer from the working group, and pushed for the inclusion of corruption in the UN guide, in the National Action Plan for UN Guiding Principles. So that is something that I'm looking forward to read. The working group is an intergovernmental working group, and they are really active and really doing their work. There was a 0 draft presented 2018 from the working group, a 2nd draft last year, and there will be a 3rd one this year. And Sweden participates in the preparation for the negotiations, which are held in October every year. There will be an open consultation tomorrow, where we have prepared the EU position for this, and that is done both in Brussels and in Geneva, depending on it should be prepared in Brussels. Sometimes it's prepared in Geneva, but we have close collaboration with our friends, with our colleagues in Geneva, of course. So I will be participating in that open consultation tomorrow. Coming to the EU level, which was mentioned, there are really a lot of happening, and it's moving forward well, it looks like it's moving forward quite quickly. We haven't seen the result yet, of course, but during the Finnish presidency in the EU last fall, the Commission actually announced that they would look into legislation on human rights due diligence. They followed up with a study, and this was demanded from the Directorate for Justice, and it's a really good report covering a lot of stakeholder consultations, and it's 550 pages. It presents 4 alternatives, from the one doing nothing to the strict legislation with follow-up sanctions and follow-up mechanisms. And in that study, I can just read that, it has been said already, but it says that the interviews in our study confirm that in the past, the human rights due diligence and environmental movements have developed in silos, but that they are beginning to recognize their commonalities precisely because of the developments around mandatory due diligence regulations. So this is actually stated in this study. And then in April, we had an oral statement from the Commissioner for Justice saying that he would like to see a mandatory due diligence on human rights and environmental issues. So we don't really know the scope of it, but environmental issues is mentioned parallel to human rights in the study. This was supported by Germany during this presentation, and also by the European Parliament, who has been a driving force in this issue for long. There was also a follow-up last week. There was a forum, an OECD forum, where the other Commissioner for Trade echoed what had been said by the Commissioner for Justice. And this is why the issues that we are talking about today is so trade related. So it will be a divided responsibility, not only from the Directorate from Trade and Justice, but from more directorates. And there are a lot of questions still. This has been said about developing a mandatory due diligence for business and human rights and environmental issues. Parallel to this, it's also another process called, we have a directive on the EU level for reporting. It's called Non-Financial Reporting Directive. This has also been looked, or it will be developed this year. So it's actually a public consultation ending June 11 on how this will look like. But the Commission has put out some key components. They are looking into including likely impacts on fundamental rights, so that's human rights. They have also specified likely environmental impacts. And they say this initiative is expected to have indirect but significant positive impacts on the environment, including climate, air, water, land, biodiversity, and resource use. So this is the Non-Financial Reporting Directive that actually they have just started to develop it, and it might be developed into a regulation, which is stronger. They have indicated that there will be a complete, that they will complete the work by the end of this year or early next year. And this has to be seen in parallel to the discussion that we see on the mandatory human rights due diligence process. Well, the question that we have are more than the answers right now, I think, but still it's moving in the direction of mandatory due diligence. So we don't know if it's going to be horizontal if it will be sectorial. We don't know if it will be as far as sanctions. I think I can say that it will be human rights and environmental issues, but will it also cover like anti-corruption efforts? What kind of companies will be covered? Will it be finalized 2021, as the Commissioner has said? And in which council working group will it be processed in? And this relates also to my work. Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we are in lead for business and human rights, but when it comes to the development of the law, etc., it might go to the Ministry of Justice or Ministry of Enterprises and so on. Just one word. I got information that yesterday from the European Parliament's Committee on Agriculture, they have put forward, I will read it out loud, that they are asking for a due diligence obligation to be placed on operators, including financiers, that place forest and ecosystem risk commodities or derivatives on the union market. So it's moving in all in many places on the EU level. So I think I will stop there, and please, I hope that I have not been too fast in explaining, and that you could see like I read the thread. But please, I'm here for questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ulrika, for that. And I have a question. I'm very much sort of rooted in the development and humanitarian sectors. Now, it seems like you have with the OECD and the UN guiding principles, you have frameworks for how corporations should conduct their work. So why are we still seeing biodiversity being under threat? Why do we see workers' rights being violated? Why do we still find cases of child labor? And I'm asking the panel that, and please indicate with your hand if you would like to answer that question. Please. Phil.
Thanks. Well, thanks very much, Henrik. I think that is a critical question, and I think to an extent, Ulrika and I have sought to just begin to describe the reasons. The reality is that the UN guiding principles are essentially embedded now in international law. But as we also know, international law and norms, unless they are brought into national and regional regulations, doesn't deliver, because there are no proper sanctions in most of international law outside of the International Criminal Court, etc. So the reality is that, as Ulrika said, the UN guiding principles were adopted 10 years ago, unanimously by every country in the world and by all the business associations in the world. And it was an extraordinary achievement to get that, because we've never had that sense of consensus before. And the UN guiding principles are quite ambitious. They talk about the responsibility of companies to respect human rights, the governments to protect human rights, and all of them to provide remedy. But they also say it's for not only the company's operations, but also their supply chains, where for lots of brands, 98% of their workforce resides. They only employ about 2% of their workforce. The rest are distributed. Over the last 40 years, they've pushed all that responsibility to somebody else through international supply chains. The reality is that for the vast majority of those international brands, they use the international supply chains, whether it's for forestry or for the fast fashion that we wear. They use those supply chains to push all the costs down and the risks down to other people. And so the supply chains have been constructed in a way that ensures that there isn't that accountability. And without accountability, that essentially can be, there's very unlikely to be any monitoring and therefore any enforcement of the UN guiding principles which people have signed up to. Now, as I say, there's some fantastic companies, and some of them are Swedish, that have signed up to a very different approach that actually do bring back in their social and environmental costs to some degree. But the majority of European and North American, as well as Brazilian and Chinese and Indian international companies simply do not bother, because they can make more money and more return to their shareholders by simply offloading and externalizing those environmental and social costs. And the fact that so much of investors demand quarterly returns from those companies that they're invested in, they have no loyalty to those companies. The average longevity of a shareholding over the last 40 years has declined from 6 years to 6 months. So there's no loyalty demonstrated by investors. It means that those companies are constantly out there trying to maximize their short-term return on investment. You can only do that by externalizing essentially those environmental and social costs. And that's why the mandatory human rights due diligence with sanctions, and it must be with sanctions, will fundamentally change the calculus of risk in boardrooms. Because if you face a massive risk by not demonstrating that you have identified the risks and addressed the environmental and human rights risks, you face the potential of a massive fine and or going to jail if there were to be criminal liability. That will change the way that those value chains and global supply chains work. And that's why so many investors and responsible companies believe this is the right thing to do now.
Could I take the floor, or?
Oh, Ulrika, please.
So yeah, thank you. I would agree partly, but if I could start with the situation in Sweden, we actually see a strong push from investors to companies to improve their human rights due diligence. So actually the pressure, I think there is a driving force if the investors are taking on their responsibility and are pushing for good human rights due diligence. And that is what I've been seeing here. We have had dialogues with investors. We also have had dialogues with civil society and the companies, unions, and all of you are so important, but just concentrating on investors. So there is a pressure, and I think that is also what we could be looking into in other parts of the world. If the investors are, demanding for a good human rights due diligence reporting, then I would say that there are also a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises. I think it's like 90% of the companies, the number of companies in almost each and every country. So we shouldn't forget about those. And there we would have to provide some kind of capacity building, because this is an area which, according to me personally anyway, it should be at the management level. So where it really works well are those companies where they have put the issue of sustainable development in each and every spectrum on a management level. So it will be on top of the board meetings agenda. The director for purchasing, the director of communication, the CEO, the CFO would all be sitting around the table discussing this issue. So it should be a core issue of the company. So that would be some of the issues that could be improved, and in that perspective could lead to a better implementation and better result. Thank you.
Yes, Maria, and then we'll have a quick response from Phil before we let in the participants.
Thank you so much, and interesting listening to both of you, Phil and Ulrika. And I also think we have to work in many ways. We have to look at what's happening on the ground, because there is a demand for, like the commodities that I was mentioning. The demand is increasing. There's always a market, and that's the sad thing. So if we regulate at one part, it could be sold to another market which are not that much interested in sustainability or environmental or human rights aspects. So like the way we work as SNC, we also support the civil society organizations, we support the indigenous peoples, the local communities, in order for themselves to stand up for their rights and decide about their future. We have a very good example from Gabon, for example, where the world leading agri-commodity producer is in a close relation with the government and has deforested and planted specifically oil palm. And none of the communities have ever met and discussed their situation, and understanding that they were not the only community affected until partners of ours went in and worked together with them in order to actually inform about their rights, inform about the company itself and the muscles it has, but also inform about the international debate going on, as you were mentioning, Ulrika, what's happening now with states trying to regulate better, and that also can benefit communities that are the most affected. So I think that is also as important. And we also see in the case of palm oil that there's an increase pressure on higher production, higher yields, because we use it for so many various things nowadays, even for biofuel. And that actually causes a situation in a national context where the civil societies are not able to make enough space for true policy changes in their own country, because the market is there pushing for more, increasing the demand, and that includes even the EU market. So I think it's interesting now that the EU has taken a standpoint on actually addressing deforestation globally. But we also have to take responsibility for our consumption and the way we consume commodities that are having these severe consequences if not regulated, or if regulations are not followed, because it's also an issue of implementation. So we can have it on paper, we can have it in a legal framework, and we heard David Boyd earlier today. There's so many conventions already regulating this, but the implementation is as important.
Thank you, Maria. And a quick response from Phil before we let in the participants with their questions.
No, I think Ulrika and Maria have said let's go to questions because there's not much time left. That's fine. Okay,
fine. So this is a learning opportunity for the participants. Please ask your questions, and Victor will help us with that.
Yes, hello. We have actually got quite a few questions. We have, first of all, a question to Phil from WeEffect. What impact do you see so far from the COVID-19 crisis on environmental human rights defenders?
Thanks. That's a very important question, and one that's fundamentally important. I think the first thing I'd say is just it's very important that we treat these two things together, human rights defenders and environmental defenders. I've never met an environmental defender that's doing it singularly because of a snail or a toad. They are always thinking about the communities alongside the nature that they're trying to preserve. And what we're seeing in terms of the pandemic at the moment, and people can go on our site and there's a whole section that we put over to civic freedoms and the protection of civic freedoms and human rights defenders, and there's a new piece there which is monitoring the impact of the pandemic on the attacks on human rights and environmental defenders. And we can see that already the pandemic is being used by unscrupulous business, often in collusion with authoritarian governments, to silence human rights and environmental defenders. Obviously, there are ruthless businesses around the world that are willing to use the pandemic and the lockdowns as an opportunity to drive for deregulation, but also to open up new plants and new mines, new exploitation of forests in ways that don't meet the environmental impact assessments, etc. Let's get on with it and let's get these things done. And so the people that have opposed that are often now isolated because of lockdown, have found themselves exposed to very high levels of abuse. Now that comes on top of already a rising level of abuse and silencing of human rights and environmental defenders around the world, particularly over the last 10 years. And we're getting now the situation, you can go on the site and also see the trackers of the SLAP suits, which are increasingly being used by business. Essentially an abuse of legislation. SLAP stands for strategic litigation against public participation. So it's trying to essentially load on a whole set of spurious legal cases against environmental and human rights defenders to bankrupt their organizations through legal costs and distract them from opposing irresponsible investments by forcing them to focus on legal cases. So all these different strategies are being used alongside, of course, the tragedies of assassinations and violence, as well as the intimidation that is the usual situation for too many human rights and environmental defenders around the world.
Then we have a question to Ulrika. It seems that the Swedish government has been hesitant to introduce legislation on mandatory due diligence for companies. What is the position of the Swedish government in terms of binding human rights due diligence? Is it being developed, and is there a document stating the official position of the government?
Thank you for that question, which is really important. Actually, after lunch today, I will have a meeting with all the relevant departments at the government. There are a lot of departments involved in this process, as you might imagine. Department of Justice, Enterprises, Environment, etc. So we are developing some kind of position, but we don't have anything written yet. But it's high on our agenda, and I have a close dialogue with our political management within this area.
Okay, thank you. Maybe there is time for one last question, which is quite interesting. There are many tools out there. We have the UNGC, we have the UNDP, we have the SHIFT project, we have the GRI, we have the OECD due diligence, we have ISO 26000, regional, national initiatives, and etc. But only 14,000 companies since 2000 are using the UN Guiding Principles. We have about 900,000 companies only in Sweden. How do we scale up? Maybe Maria or Phil would like to make a comment.
Over to you.
Over to me. How do we scale up? Yeah, well, I think we are in the Center 2020. Can we continue? That's my question. Can we actually continue? And I think we need to actually put more emphasis on the legally binding processes. We've been working too long, put too much effort, I would say, into voluntary schemes without actually achieving what we would like to achieve. So I also heard companies saying that we would like to have a legal framework because that would actually direct us and assist us. And it's also a much tougher argument when you go into negotiations with your suppliers or with your customers, that this is actually a legally binding thing. We cannot negotiate it, and they cannot turn to another company because it's not about their policy. So I think we have to put emphasis on that and also make it more obvious for everyone in our society that these abuses still takes place. Because if people would know, there would be much higher resistance, I think.
Okay, thank you. It's actually 10 to 12, and I can see Phil is already on his way to sign off.
No, I would like to speak if I can.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please, Phil.
Can I say something?
Go
Is
ahead.
it time?
Yes, go ahead, Phil.
Thanks, Noel, because I just think that's such an important question. I wanted to say, firstly, that the pace of implementation of the guiding principles has been glacial. And we have to be able to act fast. We need a fair and fast transition to zero carbon economies. We need a rapid transition away in terms of to address the rising sense of dissatisfaction with global markets. There's a collapse of public trust in global markets. Look at the Edelman Trust Barometer if you want to see more on that. And the pandemic is doing more. The global markets are associated in the public mind pretty much universally outside China with inequality, rootless corporations, with precarious employment, stagnant or poverty wages. We've got to find a new method of delivering shared prosperity and shared security. The last 10 years has been very important and there's been significant advances, but the pace in most situations has been glacial. And that has to speed up. We need, and John Ruggie, who the author of the original guiding principles, has spoken out forcefully on this, saying, I advocated a smart mix. And in the first 10 years, we have not had that. We have had an almost singular dependence on voluntary initiative. And we need now to bring in the mandatory side of this, the obligation, the legislation and the regulation that will go alongside that. And I think, as Ulrike was saying, we need much more the investors to also be held to account, so that the investors are also putting in a strong message to business that it is no longer tolerable to deliver more climate breakdown, to deliver more alienation of workers and communities and their dispossession through their participation in markets. We have to make markets work for everyone and for the environment. And so we need now that kind of mandatory approach, the regulatory approach, alongside the voluntary and investor approaches. And that's why so many companies are now speaking out alongside civil society for a level, because they believe things like a mandatory human rights due diligence legislation in Europe will deliver a level playing field for them. It will deliver legal certainty for them, and they will be rewarded, as they should be rewarded, for doing the right thing. And the laggards who violate environmental safeguards and human rights of workers and communities will be punished through sanctions, as they should be. And that's the only way we'll be able to move forward. And I think the opportunity now is for civil society to cooperate with this rising number of investors and companies, along with parliamentarians and governments that are speaking out for this increasingly. And we have to be able to come together to drive a bold new initiative. And Europe has a fundamentally important leadership role. When Europe changes its business regulation, that becomes very quickly the internationally accepted norm. Look at what's happened on the CPRD. Essentially, international business, if it has to operate to those conditions in Europe, very quickly starts to use those same standards internationally, because it doesn't really have the opportunity. It's too much cost to deliver different standards to different places. So that's why Europe plays such a fundamentally important role, and why I'm unfortunately living in the UK and outside Europe at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much, Phil. We actually need to wrap up, and so let me then give very warm thank you to all the participants, to Maria, to Phil, and to Ulrika, and not least to Henrik, who made the moderation of this session. We will now have a good 5, 6, 7 minutes of break, and then we will have the final session between 12 and 12:30, which is called The Future of Aid. Will biodiversity become a central theme in the coming decades development cooperation? And with us we have Ulrika Moder, Assistant Secretary General of UNDP. We have Karin Lexén, Secretary General of SSNC, and we have the moderator Eva Åberg, who is newly appointed Director for We Agroforestry. So see you in about 5 or 6 minutes. Thank you, everyone.
Hej och välkomna till Nätverket Grönt Bistånds sista webbinarium för den här gången, för de här 2 dagarna. Och det här webbinariet handlar om biståndets framtid. Kommer biologisk mångfald bli ett centralt tema i framtidens utvecklingssamarbete? Och som ni märker så kommer det här webbinariet hållas på svenska, inte på engelska som de andra i hela serien har gjort. Men jag hoppas att våra åhörare och ni som ser förstår svenska allihopa. Jag heter Eva Åberg och är verksamhetschef på Viskogen, eller Vi Agroforestry som vi heter på engelska. Och som tydligare beskriver vad vi sysslar med. Utbildning av småbrukare i östra Afrika i hållbara jordbruksmetoder genom agroforestry, och där är biologisk mångfald en viktig komponent. Med oss på det här webbinariet så har vi Ulrika Modér som är assisterande generalsekreterare och chef för UNDPs avdelning för externa relationer och påverkansarbete. Och Karin Lexén, generalsekreterare på Naturskyddsföreningen, som ni också har sett här tidigare idag. Välkomna båda 2. Först kommer Ulrika att ge en kort överblick av UNDPs arbete, inte minst i relation till just biologisk mångfald. Och jag tror möjligen att du har en presentation, Ulrika, jag vet inte.
Jag tror att jag struntar i att lägga upp den, utan jag pratar och så får vi tillfälle också för en dialog, tror jag. Ska jag dra igång?
Yes, varsågod.
Ja, vad bra. Ja, men tack för tillfället att vara med här idag och också för att ni har skapat det här nätverket med ett engagemang för biologisk mångfald och miljöfrågor i centrum för utvecklingspolitiken. När de globala målen för hållbar utveckling beslutades 2015 så var ju det ett väldigt viktigt beslut och egentligen någon form av samlingsbeslut efter många årtionden av diskussioner om hur både ekonomiskt, socialt och miljömässigt hållbar utveckling måste hänga samman. Och jag behöver ju egentligen inte föreläsa eller tala för er om betydelsen av miljöfrågor eller biologisk mångfald för utvecklingspolitiken. World Economic Forum konstaterade i sin senaste riskrapport att förlusten av biologisk mångfald, eller det som ibland kallas för den 6:e massutrotningen, faktiskt utgör en av de största riskerna för mänskligheten och för vår gemensamma framtid. Större än både terrorism och andra typer av militära hot som vi ofta diskuterar. Jag behöver egentligen inte heller förklara betydelsen av att upprätthålla våra ekosystem och investera i ekosystemtjänster för bekämpning av fattigdom eller för att också hantera den här typen av pandemier som vi nu befinner oss mitt i. Eller det faktum att när vi raserar den biologiska mångfalden och våra ekosystem så möjliggör vi också den här typen av pandemier. Men däremot så tänker jag att det är viktigt i det här samtalet att se att vi befinner oss i någon form av vägskäl. Därför att vad vi riskerar att se är ju en tid då de här frågorna antingen kommer mer i centrum för diskussionen, alternativt att de faller undan återigen och att de modiga beslut som fattades 2015, både vad gäller klimatavtalet men också att säkerställa att miljö, ekonomi och social hållbarhet hänger samman i en gemensam dagordning, att de besluten nog faller tillbaka i betydelse. Vi har ju talat de senaste åren väldigt ofta om klimatkrisen som ett av de största hoten mot mänskligheten, men vi hade också bestämt oss för att detta året skulle bli ett super year for nature. Ett år då vi också lyfter fram betydelsen av den storskaliga förlusten av biologisk mångfald. En fråga som behöver ta större plats och där vi också såg att vi jämte klimatfrågan också skulle kunna lyfta fram hur otroligt betydelsefullt investeringar i att bibehålla och upprätthålla biologisk mångfald och våra ekosystem är för en ekonomiskt och socialt hållbar utveckling. Men också för att kunna bromsa klimatförändringarna. Så nature at the heart of development, det var också det som vi hade beslutat ifrån FNs utvecklingsprogram att vi skulle lyfta fram under detta superår för naturen, då en räcka av internationella toppmöten skulle hållas för att diskutera både klimat och biologisk mångfald. Och det är viktigt att se att vi faktiskt som utvecklingsprogram har fått ett tillfälle att diskutera de här frågorna mycket mer. Det kanske inte är känt för alla, men UNDP har fokus på biologisk mångfald och klimatfrågor i 130 av medlemsstaterna. Så det är en väldigt omfattande del av vårt arbete. Och vi har under de senaste åren kunnat se att diskussionen om både klimat men också biologisk mångfald har rönt allt större intresse. Jag nämnde World Economic Forum, men vi ser också när vi lyfter fram de här frågorna i diskussioner med våra medlemsstater att de på många sätt blir en samlande kraft i systemet och att det finns en allt större förståelse för betydelsen av både klimat och biologisk mångfald som frågor som behöver diskuteras i centrum för en ekonomiskt hållbar utveckling. Och ska jag se här. När vi samverkar i de här frågorna i länder så gör vi det tillsammans med civilsamhällesorganisationer, vi gör det i samarbete med förstås lokalsamhällen men också med näringslivet. Och när vi diskuterar också återuppbyggnaden efter pandemin, alltså den socioekonomiska responsen som också UNDP har fått ansvar för att leda, så är vår avsikt att också sätta miljö och klimat i centrum för de diskussionerna. Vi har en möjlighet nu och Achim Steiner som leder FNs utvecklingsprogram i UNDP, han har sagt att vi står i någon form av vägskäl då vi kan upprätthålla och säkerställa de principer som vi gjorde gällande i besluten kring Agenda 2030, nämligen att vi inte kommer att ha en ekonomiskt och socialt hållbar utveckling med mindre än att vi också sätter miljö och klimat i centrum för diskussionerna. Så att här tror jag att UNDP, givet vårt ledarskap för den socioekonomiska responsen som generalsekreteraren har gett, faktiskt kan ha en väldigt viktig roll och att vi behöver utveckla då de här principerna för vad som ska vara gällande i den socioekonomiska responsen tillsammans med aktörer i civilsamhället men också med näringslivet. FN och det samlade biståndet är ju som vi vet en väldigt begränsad del av den totala utvecklingsfinansieringen och med de risker, jag tänker också på den titeln ni har för seminariet idag, som vi ser att biståndet kommer att minska i omfång i och med att många ekonomier i givarländerna försämras, så behöver vi verkligen också se hur kan vi mobilisera utvecklingsfinansiering där också miljö och klimat finns i centrum. Och det är här som jag menar att vi behöver diskutera riskerna för att de här frågorna faller bort i prioriteringen samtidigt som vi egentligen borde skjuta fram dem, verkligen sätta dem i centrum för diskussionerna. Och vi har ju väldigt, väldigt många exempel från de här 130 länderna där vi kan visa på hur viktiga ekosystemtjänster är för att upprätthålla ekonomin. Man talar ibland om att ekosystemtjänster och miljö upprätthåller långt över hälften av vår globala ekonomi. Det här är inte väl känt ibland alla och det behöver verkligen bli det för att förstå betydelsen så att de ekonomiskt rationella argumenten kommer att vara viktiga när vi ska säkerställa att miljöfrågorna inte faller bort från agendan när de faktiskt behövs som allra bäst. Och för att lyckas med det här så har vi sagt att man skulle kunna diskutera 5 olika sakområden som centrala. Och då talar vi om stora frågor. Det handlar om en transformation av det finansiella systemet där vi verkligen riktar tydligt investeringar i naturbaserade innovationer som accelererar en hållbar utveckling och talar om detta som en möjlighet för den socioekonomiska återuppbyggnaden. Vi behöver förstås, och det här är också centralt även för er som är engagerade för miljö- och klimatfrågor, stärka god samhällsstyrning, värna om rättsstatens principer och också i det arbetet titta särskilt på naturbaserade skyddsnät som skyddar och stärker rättigheter för grupper som är sårbara för förlusten av biologisk mångfald. Och då tänker jag till exempel på ursprungsfolk men också andra diskriminerade grupper i samhället. Vi behöver sätta ett särskilt fokus på global konsumtion och produktion och kanske så är det så att också i många av de länder där vi överkonsumerar så har en diskussion om vår levnadsstil också väckt eller också accentuerats också som en följd av pandemin och förstås också den klimatdebatt som vi har haft de senaste åren. Så konsumtion- och produktionsfrågorna måste också finnas i centrum för återuppbyggnadsarbetet och där både miljö men också förstås social hållbarhet finns med. Och sen titta på vilken typ av systemförändringar som vi kan diskutera när vi placerar miljö och klimat i centrum för både nationell men också sektoriell planering och övervakningssystem. Alltså hur vi tittar på naturbaserade skyddsnät men också i det arbetet också prata om pandemin och hur vi kan minimera riskerna för den här typen av zoonotiska sjukdomar. Så att jag tror att vi måste ta lite spjärn i det faktum att den här pandemin har skakat om oss rejält. Och utöver också de ekonomiska argument som vi behöver lyfta fram också tala om då de här zoonotiska sjukdomarna och det faktum att pandemier riskerar att komma i spåren av nedbrutna ekosystem. Och sen förstås mobilisera samhället och det här är ju inte minst många av er roll att lyfta fram naturbaserade lösningar. Olika globala kampanjer behöver komma på plats. Det är som jag sa inledningsvis och har upprepat och det är kanske mitt huvudbudskap. Inte givet att vi kommer att kunna upprätthålla engagemanget för miljö- och klimatfrågorna. Så här behövs ett starkt tryck, det behövs nya idéer och väldigt tydliga principer för vad som ska vara gällande när vi nu svarar mot den här ekonomiska recessionen som kommer i spåren av covid-19 och som kommer att definiera väldigt mycket av samhällsdebatten, väldigt mycket av hur länder budgeterar men också hur det internationella samarbetet fungerar. Och då vill jag ändå avsluta med det hoppfulla faktum att, som jag sa, vi har under de senaste åren satt både klimat men också miljö i centrum för våra diskussioner med medlemsstaterna. Det har vi gjort som FN:s utvecklingsprogram. För ett antal år sedan så hade detta inte varit givet eller kanske ens möjligt. Man hade tyckt att det var en särfråga. Så är det inte idag. Frågan har lyfts högre upp på dagordningen, men låt oss säkerställa att det inte trillar ner igen. Det vore ett enormt misstag och vi har helt enkelt inte tid eller råd med det misstaget. Så det var några inledande ord från mig.
Tackar. Tack för det Ulrika. Det är ju och extremt viktigt att vi jobbar på de här övergripande nivåerna med riktlinjer naturligtvis för hur vi ska ha det i framtiden. Om man går tillbaks till det som jag i alla fall och kanske Karin möjligen, Karin sitter väl också på en övergripande nivå. Men det är ju själva biståndet. Inom biståndet så har vi ju länge jobbat med resiliensfrågor, inte lika mycket med biodiversitet. Om jag börjar med att fråga dig Karin, hur kommer ni att ta er an biodiversitetsfrågorna i den praktiska biståndsverksamheten?
Men låt mig först säga att jag tycker att frågan om resiliens och motståndskraften är ju otroligt central i hela den diskussion som vi har just nu. Därför att vi ser ju att om vi har ett både socialt och ekologiskt resilient samhälle, då klarar vi bättre att stå emot den här typen av utmaningar som den här pandemin nu innebär. Och där har vi, bara för att knyta an till det som du sa Ulrika, att vår roll just nu, jag delar helt och hållet det att alltså vi står verkligen, man kan säga att det är ett öppet fönster för möjligheter. Det kan gå åt vilket håll som helst. Det är just nu vi kan forma det narrativ som kommer att berättas efteråt. Och jag tror att just vikten av att lyfta fram kopplingen mellan det sociala och ekologiska kommer vara väldigt viktigt nu framöver. Och där har ju vi länge som Naturskyddsföreningen tillsammans med partners jobbat kring att koppla samman rättighetsfrågor och frågor om miljö och biodiversitet, småskaligt fiske, utveckling av agroforestry och hållbart skogsbruk och så vidare. Och det är någonting vi kommer fortsätta att göra. Och sen är det också viktigt, tänker jag, när vi pratar om alla de här frågorna, att vi ser att detta är en viktig del av biståndet. Men jag tänker också, när jag lyssnar på dig Ulrika, det är så otroligt positivt tycker jag också att UNDP och FN går före nu och visar att vi kan inte negligera miljöfrågorna. De är liksom fundamentet för att vi kommer att lyckas med också de andra frågorna. Och då är det också så att det här är en fråga som är bredare än bistånd. Om vi inte får andra politikerområden i Sverige, i EU, globalt att samverka till exempel inom jordbruk, inom skogsbruk, inom urban utveckling och så vidare, då kommer det heller inte att gå. Så vad vi kommer att göra fortsättningsvis är att fortsätta knyta ihop biodiversitetsfrågorna också med klimatutmaningarna och att koppla det till praktiskt arbete med våra samarbetspartner, men också i debatten här hemma i Sverige och peka på att vi kan liksom inte köra i stuprör utan vi måste koppla ihop de här frågorna. Och där är ju den första utmaningen som du nämnde Ulrika med transformationen av det finansiella systemet. Det är otroligt viktigt. Ska det finansiella systemet, ska våra offentliga pengar vara med och understödja det gröna arbetet, den gröna omställningen, eller ska det fortsätta att liksom dra åt fel håll? Och det finns otroligt mycket att göra där. Så att det kan man också komma ihåg när man pratar om de här frågorna, att det finns andra närliggande sektorer som också behöver samverka. Förstås näringslivet också. Det var lite bredare svar Eva, men jag tycker det kan vara kul att få respondera lite också.
Ja, men precis. Nej, men, det låter absolut som det är en extremt viktig roll som inte minst vi som biståndsorganisationer och vi som faktiskt håller på med biologisk mångfaldsfrågor på ett eller annat sätt måste ta tag i också och jobba med i Sverige gentemot regering och andra också. Jag undrar lite grann då Ulrika, eftersom du säger att ni faktiskt har haft det här i centrum under ganska lång tid nu i UNDP. Vad har responsen varit hos mottagarregeringar om man säger runt om i världen? Finns det något generellt svar på det eller är det väldigt olika?
Nej, men, och det var det jag ville ge uttryck för, att vi ser ett växande intresse hos medlemsstaterna och i de länder som vi verkar för de här frågorna. Och det är ju en samverkan mellan den globala debatt som pågår, liksom det ökade kunskapsläget, det faktum att man ser väldigt många av de här smygande effekterna också påverka länder, alltså apropå resiliens, hur sårbar man är för naturkatastrofer och också för den här typen av situationer som vi är nu med pandemin. Så att, vi ser absolut ett ökat intresse och jag skulle vilja säga att momentum, och det var ju också därför som vi hade laddat upp för det här Super Year for Nature i FNs regi. Ni har ju sett generalsekreteraren prioritera klimatfrågan högt. Och nu var det verkligen läge för att lyfta fram också i den politiska diskussionen frågorna om biologisk mångfald. För att visa hur det här samverkar, hur biologisk mångfald också kan vara ett svar på den här liksom dystopiska situationen vi befinner oss i förhållande till klimatförändringarna, och att vi kunde tala om också nature-based solutions for development, alltså hur investeringar i de här områdena också kan möjliggöra ekonomisk utveckling, hur det kan möjliggöra investeringar i de sociala områden som nu visar att våra samhällen är så enormt sårbara i den ökade ojämlikhet som vi ser världen över. Så att vi hade ju ett verkligt momentum tycker jag för att lyfta fram de här frågorna, och betydelsen har ju inte på något sätt blivit mindre med anledning av pandemin, men pandemin kommer ju få betydande effekter, alltså dels på den globala ekonomin, det kommer att få effekter som jag sa på biståndsnivåerna. Och därför så är det så otroligt viktigt, och det är bra att Karin fångar upp det här, så biståndet måste vara en katalysator för utvecklingsfinansiering, klimatfinansiering, finansiering för biologisk mångfald, och där vi också visar hur det här hänger ihop med socialt och ekonomiskt hållbar utveckling. Och det är där jag menar att nu behövs det ett ordentligt tryck, därför att FN agerar ju det är en politiskt styrd organisation och vi agerar ju på medlemsstaternas förfrågningar, så därför så vill vi ju också att det ledarskap som har visat sig finnas inom FNs fonder och program, men också den samverkan som vi har med också de här specialized agencies, det behöver ju upprätthållas med ett tryck och engagemang från medlemsstaterna. Och där kan ju jag naturligtvis förvänta mig att Sverige, nordiska länder och andra likasinnade verkligen kliver fram nu och säger vad är det för principer som ska vara gällande i den socioekonomiska responsen. Vilka investeringar vill vi se framöver för att kunna, om man nu använder det här begreppet, bygga tillbaka bättre samhällen. Men vi vill ju inte tillbaka, vi vill ju framåt, vi vill göra något helt annorlunda. Och för att få den diskussionen på plats så kommer det att krävas ett engagemang. Därför att jag ser risker att länder inte helt enkelt mäktar med eller klarar av att prioritera de här frågorna som vi vet. Så kunskapsläget är bra, men vi vet att det behövs liksom ett tryck, ett politiskt engagemang och intresse för att vi ska kunna upprätthålla det här.
Absolut. Och jag tänker, Karin, ni har väl jobbat länge med att faktiskt skapa det här trycket på inte minst då svenska regeringen och olika departement. Men har du erfarenhet också av liksom hur det går för era, eller i andra länder? För vi är ju inte ensamma i lilla Sverige direkt. Har ni erfarenhet av hur det ser ut i olika europeiska länder som ju verkar vara på väg åt ett annat håll ibland? Eller era partnerländer?
Jo, men vi ser ju, och det ser ju många av er som lyssnar här också som har god kunskap, och inte minst Ulrika förstås, hur väldigt många av våra samarbetspartner runt om i världen nu påverkas negativt av pandemin på många olika sätt. Alltså det är svårare att utöva sin verksamhet, förtrycket ökar i flera länder, man tar coronapandemin som en ursäkt för att inskränka rättigheter, och det är ett ökat tryck på naturresurser generellt. Så det är klart att det är ett tufft läge, samtidigt som det är det här läget när allt fler börjar förstå att vi inte kan göra hur som helst för att naturen slår på något sätt tillbaka. Och där tror jag att det blir väldigt viktigt att jobba på bredden i att skapa förståelsen för vad det är som faktiskt står på spel, för att liksom bilda opinion och kanske gå lite bredare än vad vi brukar göra i vår opinionsbildning och så. Vi pratar till exempel här i Sverige om att vi behöver ha en bred koalition också till exempel med fackföreningsrörelsen för att klara av att prata om vad innebär en grön och rättvis omställning. Så vi måste jobba på bredden, och det tror jag vi behöver göra globalt också. Sen är det väldigt viktigt nu framöver att den svenska regeringen också inte bara i retoriken, för den är jättebra, men också i hur man jobbar till exempel med Sidas framtida strategier, regionala strategier, landstrategier, miljöledningssystem och så. Verkligen ser till att biologisk mångfald får en central plats i det här arbetet och visar därmed att man går från ord till handling i det praktiska arbetet. Det kommer bli otroligt viktigt att EUs arbete med biologisk mångfald i sin strategi verkligen vågar gå fram. Och där är det klart att det finns ett stort problem. Ungern är ett av de länderna där vi då via vår samarbetsorganisation EEB, European Environmental Bureau, ser att det är jättetufft. Och även, vi vet andra länder, Polen och så vidare. Så även i Europa så är det ju besvärligt för civilsamhället att riktigt få det manöverutrymme som vi behöver. Och vi behöver verkligen stöd då från vår regering och från det internationella samfundet att ge stöd till civilsamhällenas möjlighet att utöva den här kraften. Och sen behöver vi också samarbeta med andra, och vi behöver samarbeta med näringslivet. Och jag tycker jag ser i de samtal som vi för här hemma i Sverige då att det är många inom näringslivet som är på tå när det gäller klimatfrågorna, fortsatt och säger att det är en fortsatt prioritering. Och där behöver vi fortsätta prata om vikten av att se klimat och biologisk mångfald i ett gemensamt sammanhang. Att det inte går att lösa klimatkrisen utan att också lösa frågorna kring biologisk mångfald.
Så med andra ord så kommer vi att behöva från och med nu egentligen mainstreama biologisk mångfald i allt vi gör.
För det har vi ju sagt att vi ska göra i och med beslutet kring Agenda 2030. Och jag tänker också, Karin och Eva och andra som lyssnat, att det finns verkligen ett momentum därför att EU har ju också sagt att man ska prioritera de här frågorna. Man har ju lyft fram klimatfrågan särskilt, men vi vet att det finns ett större sammanhang runt detta och också en möjlighet att också lyfta fram frågan om biologisk mångfald. Så att här tror vi också att EU skulle kunna ha en jätteviktig roll i förhållande till FN-systemet och att det finns också ett gemensamt intresse i att upprätthålla de här multilaterala systemen och en regelbaserad världsordning. Apropå betydelsen av god samhällsstyrning och rättsstatens principer så är ju EUs aktörskap också i de medlemsstaterna väldigt, väldigt viktigt i FN-systemet.
Jag delar det. Jag tänker också att det som du lyfter kring rättsstat och demokrati överhuvudtaget är otroligt viktiga frågor. Och det kommer också vara viktigt att EU visar framfötterna och går före när det gäller då sin egen politik på jordbruksområdet och på skogsområdet och fiskeområdet och så. Så det är viktigt att se att biologisk mångfald handlar ju om väldigt många olika sektorer.
Avslutningsvis, vår tid kommer väldigt snabbt till sin ända. Men avslutningsvis, Ulrika, ser du någon annan global allierad aktör som man borde ha i det här arbetet som man kanske inte riktigt har för tillfället?
Jag tror att det finns goda förutsättningar att skapa det partnerskapet, men det behövs ett tydligt initiativ och tryck och man behöver diskutera de här principerna som ska vara gällande för den socioekonomiska återuppbyggnaden som förhoppningsvis kan leda oss fram till. Vi hade ju också sagt att vi skulle ha decade of action inför implementeringen av de globala målen för hållbar utveckling. Vi har 10 år kvar. Vi såg redan när vi följde upp målen under hösten i samband med generalförsamlingen att det var ett par områden där vi rörde oss i fel riktning. Och de som vi särskilt har satt fokus på, det är ju faktiskt frågan om klimat, miljö, men också då de ökade ojämlikheter som vi ser världen över. Så här visar vi ju också det som Karin upprepat och sagt, alltså betydelsen av att ha en agenda där vi tittar på både sociala och miljömässiga dimensioner i agendan för hållbar utveckling som högprioriterade när vi bygger tillbaks bättre fungerande samhällen nu efter pandemin. Men med det vill jag också säga att FN och medlemsstaterna, aktörer i civilsamhället, alltså den normerande rollen att tala om vad som är viktigt, otroligt viktigt. Men vi behöver mobilisera det privata kapitalet och det är därför som jag också som en av de första punkterna pekade på betydelsen av en transformation av det finansiella systemet. Och att jag också lyfte in att World Economic Forum faktiskt har identifierat förlusten av biologisk mångfald, den sjätte massutrotningen, som en av de absolut största riskerna. Så att den privata sektorns aktörer och inte minst på investerarsidan, och här vill jag också lyfta fram att Sverige har ju flera ledande initiativ, alltså det är nätverk av investerare som finns på Sidas plattform har ju varit en inspirationskälla till generalsekreterarens globala nätverk av investerare. Storbritanniens tidigare riksbankschef Mark Carney går in nu som en särskild rådgivare på klimatområdet till generalsekreteraren, men kommer ju också hantera den här typen av frågor. Så att titta på också de finansiella aktörerna, inte bara den privata sektorn som näringsliv utan snarare kanske på finansieringssidan tror jag kan vara väldigt avgörande framöver.
Avslutningsvis då, Karin, vill du kommentera det här?
Nej, vi är väldigt överens om det här. Inte så överraskad. Men jag tror att Viktor vill komma in så att jag tror faktiskt att jag lämnar av här och tackar för att få vara med.
Ja,
tack så hemskt mycket båda två och då lämnar jag över till Viktor Åström från Naturskyddsföreningen som även är en del av Grön biståndsorganisationskommitté. Tack för oss.
Tack så mycket Eva, och det var ju egentligen tänkt att vi skulle ha en del frågor här, men vi börjar få lite dåligt med tid så att det är möjligt att vi helt enkelt inte hinner mer än en sista fråga. Ulrika, om du orkar med det. Det kommer en fråga som var så, du nämnde som hastigast behovet av globala kampanjer. Kan du då ge något exempel på vad du utifrån din horisont saknar i vad civilsamhället liksom jobbar för globalt?
Men som jag sa, alltså nu formulerar ju världssamfundet den så kallade socioekonomiska responsen på pandemin. Jag tycker att man måste använda sig av det tillfället. UNDP har fått det tekniska ledarskapet, men vi behöver också stöd och backning för att säkerställa att miljö- och klimatfrågorna kommer i centrum för det här. Så att ni som är engagerade och ser betydelsen av det här, att ni lyfter debatten, att ni får fler medlemsstater via era internationella nätverk att lyfta debatten och se möjligheterna i det här. Att våra investeringar måste riktas mot både investeringar i miljö men också klimatfrågorna. Det är helt avgörande nu. Så att, liksom, vilka principer ska vara ledande när vi bygger tillbaka bättre fungerande samhällen och hanterar den ekonomiska kris vi har framför oss?
Tusen tack Ulrika, vilka inspirerande avslutande ord. Tack då till dig, tack också till Karin och tack såklart till Eva Åberg från Viskogen. I will now just briefly kind of sum up these 2 days and switch back to English, which is the main language of the conference as such. And I mean, my feeling is like, wow, such 2 very inspiring days. How do you feel, Karin, about it?
No, I've been very impressed by the program. I can say that since I wasn't part really in drafting it, and also by all interesting speakers, and it also tells me that we are many who are engaged in this, and that is also very promising, because relating to what Ulrika said, there is a need for really stepping up and push for this, because it isn't guaranteed that it will be biodiversity or human rights or climate issues that will be at the forefront. So we all have a huge responsibility right now, and I think these 2 days has really inspired us and motivated us to do so.
Thank you very much. And I think, I mean, the aim of these 2 days has, of course, been to enhance our knowledge on biodiversity and development and the linkages between, but it has also been to show how we as civil society can join hands from different locations. And I think we've seen that we've done a really good job. We've had many interesting participants. We've had governmental representatives, UN, and us from Swedish civil society, the British civil society sharing our experiences. And just to sum up, then yesterday we covered biodiversity and its importance for development. We looked at some of the negative trends that we're seeing and some of the drivers of the decline. We also looked at CSO responses, and we looked at what SIDA, the Swedish state agency, is doing. Today, we looked at the international level and the recognition of human and indigenous people rights, how indigenous people can protect and support biodiversity. And we also talked a bit about participation and human well-being, and we also concluded by discussing the future of aid. The next steps then, I mean, it was organized by the Grönt Bistånd Green Aid Network, is of course to continue our engagement in the key processes that we have been discussing for this couple of days. We want to see an integration of human rights in the CBD agreement. We want to push for business commitments and action, as well as mandatory human and environmental rights due diligence legislations. And when it comes to the Green Aid Network, we are planning for further dialogue, and we will advocate towards the Swedish Foreign Ministry during this autumn. We are also having our next network meeting at next Monday, the 8th of June at 2:30. And if you're not part of the network yet, you are free to email either me, Viktor Åström, at Naturskyddsföreningen.se, or Göran Eklöf at wwf.se, and you can team up with us. So by that, I just want to say thank you for joining us, and have a good day.